9:01 Pacific Daylight Time, so let's go ahead and get this meeting going. I am not Coco Casino, who usually chairs these meetings. Coco couldn't make it today, so she asked me to sit in and assist with the chair of this meeting. My name is Ryan Derby. I am the acting division chief of Caltrans Division of Transportation Planning in Sacramento, a position formerly held by this gentleman right here to my right. Chris, if you want to mention your transition.
Yeah, just real quick.
Ryan is acting for me, and I'm taking a new position as a Southern California Program Manager for Planning and Mobile Programs. I will continue to work for COCO in a slightly different function, assisting with administering the program in Southern California over our 4 districts. I'm going to be continually involved with freight. It's obviously very important in Southern California. We're going to see the CFMP development process through. We're going to deliver this thing. And so glad to be here and just in a slightly different function. So.
All right, thanks, Chris. So before we start, I would like to thank the Alameda County CTC staff, specifically Carolyn Clevenger, Director of Planning, Vanessa Lee, County Clerk of the Commission, and Vanessa Herrera, Administrative Analyst, who have all been very generous in hosting and accommodating us today, so thank you. All right, on to some housekeeping items. So please make sure you just sign the sign-in sheet just outside the room. If you leave before the meeting is adjourned, please return your name tent to the registration table. The restrooms are located right outside this door over here and to the left. And then in the event of an emergency, the evacuation procedures are as follows. Please follow the exit signs and staff will assist you. Okay, moving on to lunch. So, yeah, we're talking about lunch already. We'll break for lunch at 11:45 a.m. We'll have an hour and 15 minutes, and we'll return here at 1 p.m. to resume the second half of the day. And in your packet, there are several restaurants nearby, in case you need a reference of where to go to lunch. And as a reminder, these meetings are under the Bagley-Keene Act, which means they're open to the public and subject to the provisions in that act. As acting committee chair, I will allow for committee member comments. My understanding is if you need to speak traditionally in this forum, take your name tent and flip it vertical. Is that correct? Yeah. Okay. If you're in the audience and you'd like to say something, please raise your arm, hand, and camera notes. You're back there, he will assist you with the microphone. This meeting is being webcast, so it's very important that I ask that you please speak into the microphone so that those comments and questions can be recorded. It is important to note too that we may not have enough time to take all your questions or comments, but we'll have some time at the end of the meeting to potentially do so. All right, cell phones. Please make sure your cell phone is on silent. And for those sitting at the table, apparently there's some interference between the cell phone and the microphone, so it's important to keep it away. I'm trying to do that over here. And then using the microphones, which I'm still figuring out here, if anybody's going to speak at the table, you push the mute button and you'll see at the bottom of your microphone, the color of the light will change from red to green. Okay, now we're going to get into some of the agenda changes that are happening. Originally we had the investment strategy presentation discussion as item number 4. It will now go after the trends and opportunities, challenges, and scenario modeling presentation. So slight change right there. Also under item number 8, the critical rural and critical urban freight designation presentation will now be presented by Chris at Caltrans. And just a quick overview of our agenda items. Agenda item number 2, so welcome District 4 Director here, Tony Harris. Agenda item number 3, we have a welcome and overview of goods movement in the Bay Area region by Tess Lenyel. Agenda item number 4, California Freight Mobility Plan, Trends, Opportunities, Challenges, and Scenario Modeling summary by Chris Schmidt and the consultant team. Agenda item number 5, California Freight Mobility Plan, California's competitive position, Chris again and the consultant team. Agenda item number 6, California Freight Mobility Plan, Freight Investment Strategy, Chris again. You're good, Chris, thank you. We'll break for lunch at 11:45 a.m. Again, as I mentioned, till 1 o'clock. Agenda item number 7, AB 2127, electric vehicle charging infrastructure. The assessment by, I think it's Kyle Pratt, I'm sorry, is that correct? Thank you. Agenda item number 8, critical rural and critical urban freight corridor designation. Who else but Chris? Agenda item number 9, West Oakland Truck Management Plan, Patricia McGowan and Andrea Gardner. Agenda item number 10, air freight, John Bergener. That's correct, thank you. Agenda item number 11, FHWA, CTC, CalSTA, and Caltrans updates, Q&A with Tasha Clemens, Don. Chezer's here in place of Susan Ransom and Darwin Usabi, and of course Chris again. Agenda item number 12, public comments and wrap up. Okay, that was a lot to say. Made it through the introduction. Welcome everybody again. And we're going to have another welcome here from our district director, Tony Tavares. And I will give you a little bit of update on Tony. I have a few notes here. So Tony Tavares was appointed in August 2018 as the Caltrans District 4 Director, responsible for managing the day-to-day operations of the state highway system in the 9 Bay Area counties, covering 6,500 lane miles of highways and over 3,000 employees. An annual budget of $500 million and a current construction program of over $2 billion. That's a lot of money. As District 4, that is violating the cell phone rule. As District 4 Director, Tony serves as a Commissioner on the Metropolitan Transportation Commission, the Bay Area Regional Planning Organization, representing the California State Transportation Agency. Tony also serves as a Commissioner on the San Francisco Bay Conservation and Development Commission. He's an ex officio member of the Board of Directors of the Trans-Bay Joint Powers Authority, a member of the AC Transit, that's BART, BRT, Bus Rapid Transit, Policy Steering Committee, and member of the Bay Area Regional Collaborative. You have a lot going on.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Oakland. Welcome to the Bay Area. So as Ryan mentioned, I'm Tony Tavares. I'm the Caltrans District 4 Director here in the Bay Area. I'm pleased to welcome you all to today's California Freight Advisory Committee meeting, being hosted by our longtime partner, the Alameda County Transportation Commission. Thank you very much. From a geographic perspective, District 4 covers the entire San Francisco Bay Area in the region, and it represents a population of over 7 million people, encompassing 9 counties: Contra Costa, Marin, Napa, San Francisco, San Mateo, Solano, Sonoma, Santa Clara, and of course, Alameda County. In terms of infrastructure, the Bay Area, which is known for its beautiful bridges and tunnels, also has a vast freight transportation network with numerous seaports, railroads, airports, and highway facilities. Port of Oakland, which is less than a mile from here, is the most prominent of the Bay Area's numerous seaport facilities. It's ranked as the 8th busiest container port in the United States. Port of Oakland loads and discharges more than 99% of the containerized goods moving through Northern California. With regard to freight rail, the Bay Area features 2 Class 1 railroads, Union Pacific Railroad and the Burlington Northern Santa Fe Railroad. These private railroads transport intermodal container and bulk cargoes long distances over the Donner and Tehachapi routes eastward to places such as Chicago, Kansas City, and Memphis. The Bay Area also features 3 major air cargo airports that handle much of the high-value trade goods being developed and manufactured in the region, including the San Francisco International Airport, who we will be hearing from later today, the Oakland International Airport, which is just down the highway from this area, and the Norman White Mineta San Jose International Airport, located in the heart of Silicon Valley. As far as the highway network, there are over 690 centerline miles of freeways, 707 centerline miles of conventional highways, and approximately 6,500 lane miles of highways and freeways in this district alone. In terms of freight modes, trucking is the predominant mode for transporting goods in this region, with much of the truck traffic utilizing the interstate and state highway system. While improving the efficiency of California's freight transport system is vital, keeping the people, the economy, and the environment in mind is equally critical. And here in the Bay Area, we feature one of the most diverse populations, significant economies, and vulnerable environmental habitats, especially with regard to climate change and sea level rise. However, California and Caltrans, in partnership with its agencies such as the Alameda County Transportation Commission, the Metropolitan Transportation Commission, and our other congestion management agencies, other agencies, and partners continue to coordinate and work together toward implementing regionally significant freight projects that benefit these concerns. Building on the success of some of the first state funding programs ever dedicated to enhancing goods movement, such as 2006 Proposition 1B Trade Corridor Improvement Fund, newer funding opportunities such as Senate Bill 1's Trade Corridor Enhancement Program, coupled with local funding programs like Alameda County's Freight and Economic Development Program, being funded through local Measure BE sales tax dollars, will help us achieve our collective goals for freight and keep the Bay Area and California competitive. Once again, thank you everyone for attending today's California Freight Advisory Committee meeting. I look forward to working with all of you in the near future, and I welcome you to Bay Area. Thank you.
Thanks, Tony. All right, and we're now moving on to agenda item number 3. Welcome and overview of goods movement in Alameda County. We will now turn to our next agenda presented by Ted. Ted serves as Deputy Director of Planning and Policy for the Alameda County Transportation Commission, where she directs all short and long-range transportation planning. Ms. Laniel led the development of the Alameda County Goods Movement Plan, an $8 billion 30-year transportation expenditure plan.
Great, good morning, everybody, and we're so pleased to have you here at Alameda CTC to continue good partnerships in doing great things for freight and goods movement in the state of California. So we're pleased we can host you and pleased that you can be here at Alameda CTC. Wanted to share just a little bit of background about who we are and what we're doing around goods movement. We are one of the 27 self-help counties around the state of California, which means voters chose to tax themselves, reach into their pockets, and fund transportation investments. And in the measure that was passed, Measure BB that was referenced, it was passed in 2014, and it included a specific carve-out for goods movement, specifically because we have so much to do in terms of goods movement, and the voters said that's a very important part of our economy, and we want to make sure that we can fund it. We are one of the largest counties in the state of California. We have about 1.6 million people here, a very diverse county ranging from agriculture to biotech. We're part of the northern part of Silicon Valley, and we have major labs here ranging from the Lawrence Livermore labs to the Berkeley labs. And the Port of Oakland is an essential partner in helping to support all of those people, all of those businesses, and all of those jobs. And Alameda County really is the central hub in the Bay region, not only for goods movement, but for major interstate freeways. We have the highest concentration of interstate freeways here in Alameda County that help to support goods movement on trucks and bringing goods to and from the Port of Oakland, as well as all the people that are trying to get to and fro from work and education, etc. We also have extensive transit systems that are growing here in Alameda County, and that includes passenger rail that also shares the rails with the goods movement. The Port of Oakland is an essential partner to us, and I just want to say our appreciation at Alameda CTC to the Port of Oakland for being so involved in the work that we do for planning for transportation and for making sure that we can support our communities, which are built right up to the Port of Oakland and all the facilities leading into the Port of Oakland. So as Tony mentioned, about 99% of all containerized goods in Northern California are supplied through the Port of Oakland. That's significant. And it's really vital to international trade, supporting national, statewide, regional, and local economies, and very importantly, local jobs. The port is a strategic trade location. We have 2 Class 1 railroads, both UP and BNSF, that serve the Port of Oakland, major interstate freeways, as I mentioned, and it's got one of the shortest transport times to Asia, which is one of the largest markets that is served by the Port of Oakland. The port also is one of the fewest in the state of California that actually has room to grow. It has room to grow to accommodate a growing population, a growing Northern California, and it is investing to become big ship ready. And we're here to help to support that effort as partners with a program that we've worked on called GoPort, which really stands for Global Opportunities at the Port of Oakland. And this is really to help to support efficiencies and growth at the Port of Oakland so we can continue to have a very strong, efficient economy that is served by moving both goods and people in large part on the same system. But at the Port of Oakland, the GoPort project is really to improve truck and rail access to the Port of Oakland. I'll talk specifically about the 3 components of these, which is a freight intelligent transportation system component, a grade separation on the east side, and on the west side. This is over $500 million in investments that we're working on to make sure that we can really work on improving the efficiency of goods movement. And we worked throughout the region. We're a strong partner with the Metropolitan Transportation Commission in developing a goods movement plan that was adopted in 2016. The port was at the table at all of those meetings, and we adopted a goods movement plan that is reflected in the regional plan that supports these particular projects. So the port is trying to grow, but at the same time there are landside access inefficiencies that could constrain that growth if we are not able to deal with them. Right now there is a fair amount of traffic congestion, queuing, backups, emissions, community impacts, and so we are working on trying to make sure that we can clear up those bottlenecks so that we can reduce those queues and really expand the access to commercial opportunities. And then interestingly here in the Bay Area, we have something called the Bay Trail, which is a trail that is intended to circle the entire bay. And that part of that Bay Trail actually goes through the Port of Oakland. So this project is very multimodal and also trying to implement a much improved access for people who are walking and biking. These pictures, I hope you can see them. They're a little small, but the top right picture shows the conflict between the rail and trucks, where rail is passing at an at-grade location and trucks are backing up. And then you can just see on the bottom side queues that happen out at the Port of Oakland. So really we're trying to make sure that we can provide congestion relief, improve efficiency at the Port of Oakland in a sustainable way, in a multimodal way that really supports economic growth, jobs, and really supports the local community. I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. The first element that we're implementing is a freight intelligent transportation system suite of projects, suite of elements in ITS that is intended to go first in this 3 sets of projects that we're implementing, because ultimately it will help with during construction as we're constructing the 7th Street grade separation east and then subsequently the west. So this is a comprehensive set of ITS projects that are all going to be integrated so that they can provide real-time information to both folks who are circulating at the Port of Oakland as well as truckers who are coming into the Port of Oakland. It's intended to really reduce the traffic congestion and make things much more reliable for movement and mobility at the Port of Oakland on site. So it has all of these different elements, and I'm not going to go through every single one of them, but we are going to be working with the port and the city implementing and completing a fiber network there There will be an app that's developed as part of this, and then an infrastructure set up with traffic management centers connected at the Port of Oakland, the City of Oakland, connecting into the Caltrans Traffic Management Center, so that real-time information can be displayed and deployed on-site at the port for people traveling around the port, as well as the people who are miles and miles away coming in to get to their gate. They can know what the backup is, they can know where to go, they can make appointments through this app, they can make parking appointments as well from far away, and have more security and reliability of when they're coming in to get in, get what they need done, and get out so we can deliver the goods efficiently. This is just a real quick picture of a rendering of a change of message sign, which is one of the components that will be implemented as part of this project. And this is about a $30 million project. This is funded from the federal level, the state level, and here from Measure BB as well. I just want to do one more shout out and appreciation for SB1, which is so critical for our goods movement and all sorts of movement and safety and maintenance in the state of California. But SB1 is the largest portion of funding for this. We appreciate the CTC, the state of California, for that. And this project is actually going to be out for, we're releasing the contracts for bids in May. So right away we'll be implementing this. The second, well actually let me just show you that this is the project area, and the purple is showing you the 7th Street grade separation east project, which I'll talk a little bit more. The brown shows the 7th Street west, and then ITS will be throughout the Port of Oakland. So the 7th Street grade separation east is a project that is going to realign and reconstruct an underpass, a very aging underpass. This is one of the 3 main landside entry points into the Port of Oakland. And I don't know if you can see the rebar hanging off one of the bridges there that is hit by trucks. This is 1930s. This undercrossing in particular has a bridge that was built in the 1930s and another one that was built in the 1950s. And the clearance is not high enough for what we need now. If you see where all that graffiti is, that's the non-welcoming bicycle and pedestrian path. And then you can see that trucks on the bottom photo are barely clearing that undercrossing. So we're going to be bringing this up to standards. We'll be putting in a new bicycle and pedestrian path that you can see, a rendering at the bottom here, to really improve the safety, efficiency, and reliability. And more than one truck can pass underneath the bridge at a single time. Right now it's extremely tight for them to pass under that area. This is a rendering that shows the project at completion. On the right side, you can see the bicycle and pedestrian path, this higher elevation on the undercrossing, and then you can see that the rail bridge is on top. This is about a $300 million project, and again, TCEF is a major funder of this at $175 million, and we've put in local sales tax money as well to fund this project. The third project that we'll be implementing is the 7th Street Grade Separation West project. This was the brown part of that picture that I showed you, the rendering. It is an elevated facility that will be elevated over tracks, and it will allow for more efficient access for rail underneath the grade separation, and will provide more fluid flow throughout the Port of Oakland. And here is a rendering of that project at completion. That project is about $263 million, and we are currently working on design right now that is funded with the local transportation sales tax dollars. The community abuts right up to the Port of Oakland, and is an important partner that we're working with in making sure that we're providing information about the project. This is a project that we're currently working with the community and doing outreach on right now. and there are extensive environmental mitigation and community protection elements in the work that we're doing. Any project of this magnitude cannot be done by a single entity, and we have a myriad of partners that we are working with on a daily basis, actually, for these projects. And it really is a public and private partnership where we're working with all of our public agency partners, as well as the railroads and utilities and all of the telecommunications to support the ITS components. But I'd like to say that not all of transport of goods movement happens at the port. It, of course, needs to get to the port. And so the Alameda CTC recognizes and has developed a countywide rail program that is addressing the fact that there's going to be increases in goods movement, there's a demand for increases in transit, rail transit movement. And here in Alameda County, as I'm sure across the state, we see growth happening right up to the rail lines. In fact, for many of our communities, priority development areas are right next to the rail lines. And so that presents a lot of challenges for local communities and safety as we are going to be seeing increased rail and increased passenger and goods movement rail occurring. We're going to see about a doubling of projected goods movement through 2040. And we have this is the rail system in the Bay Area. In some instances, due to lack of connectivity, we have very circuitous routes that rail lines have to go through, and then a lot of shared lines with passenger and freight. And so some of the issues we have are parallel rail lines or rail lines that cross over under each other, but they don't connect. So our commission has adopted a program where we want to create junctions where there aren't junctions for increased redundancy and the most efficient use of passenger and the most efficient use of freight on these facilities. We've created, this is a program that was adopted, which includes the GoPort program as well as rail junctions, as I mentioned, and improvements, including at Jack London, for example, where there's a big pinch point and a slow point for freight coming in and out of the Port of Oakland. But in addition to that, and because of this increase, our board has even drilled down further and developed a rail safety enhancement program, because we have hundreds and hundreds of at-grade crossings for rail throughout our county. So we did develop a rail safety enhancement program that went through a prioritization process. We created a toolkit, and we're about to implement safety upgrades. But I also wanted to note that you look at goods movement, you look at rail transit movement, but for us, that also touches our children. Because we have a lot of schools that are next to the rail facilities. And so we have integrated rail safety education for our students through our Safe Routes to Schools program. We've had some schools where kids, when we went out and did the site assessments, kids were walking along the rail lines. They didn't realize that was trespassing. They just saw that as their greatest shortcut to where they wanted to go. So we're doing a lot of rail safety education through our existing Safe Routes to Schools program. We did an analysis of hundreds of crossings. We came up with Tier 1 crossings, those that are the most impacted, most dangerous, and that need the highest safety improvements, as well as the identification of a series of high priority rail corridors where our aim is to implement a suite of improvements along a corridor so it makes it safe in that entire stretch of corridor. And the kinds of things that we're doing will be implemented throughout Alameda County. Our board just earlier this year adopted a program for us to implement rail safety improvements. We're seeing that these at-grade crossing improvements, we see a preliminary cost estimate of about $60 million. So we're putting local money forward to try to initiate those and implement all sorts of different types of treatments, anti-trespassing, pedestrian assembly areas, secure crossings for all users, all sorts of investments so that we can improve the safety and reliability of our system. So that, in summary, is a lot of what we are doing and focusing on here at Alameda County. You can see that goods movement touches all of us, not only from the major Northern California support, but also down to our state schools. So thank you very much for allowing us to share with you what we're doing here in Alameda County.
Thank you, Ted. Great presentation. Does anybody have any comments or questions?
Hello, Jesse Marquez, Coach for the Environment. I want to compliment you on the app program. Just as you're well aware, when you use apps, we're talking in real time. So therefore, the information is being notified and placed up there so everyone knows it. If a truck is to break down 3, 4, 5 miles away, is that covered by one of the elements in the app program so that that truck driver can then, notify some of the headquarters that, hey, I'm broken down, that's going to cause a traffic congestion program for miles and miles and miles?
That's a good question. I mean, if it's broken down on the freeway, for example, I think that is something that would be identified through the freeway system. It's not necessarily that this app would be a trucker saying, hey, I'm broken down. That would be, it's mostly an app for them to have real-time information for their ability to enter and exit the port efficiently. The breakdowns on the freeway would be through their regular highway system.
Okay, thanks.
Anybody else? Any members of the public? Okay. Moving on to our next agenda item. California Freight Mobility Plan, Trends, Opportunities, Challenges, and Scenario Modeling. Chris.
So, thank you. We took the agenda a little bit out of order, and we wanted to do that because we wanted to really have the CFAC kind of get a little bit more immersed in what the team has been doing to develop the freight plan. And a big part of that is what we're going to present here with Fatima. She's going to present some recent trends, and she's part of the consultant team that's been working with us to sort of help frame a little bit, what we're trying to communicate in the CFMB. And, it doesn't take but, a little bit of spending time on the news feeds to see that trade's a big deal. The president was threatening to close down the U.S.-Mexico border. There's a lot of backlash against that. The economic impacts of that were going to be tremendous. And I think that was communicated collectively by industry as well as others to make it clear that the border and the relationship with our Mexican trading partner is super, super important. So that's a trend, that's an example. You may have heard about the China trade deal that continues to be negotiated that could have huge ramifications on what happens in the U.S. as well as in China. And lots of firms are basically onshoring their manufacturing again. That's another one of these mega trends. So these are the kinds of things that we should concern ourselves with, and so part of the discussion here at CFAC should be, how do we incorporate that into our thought process? Even though these are not understood today, they're going to be emerging. So we wanted to make sure that the CFAC really had the best available information and really share with you what the team's been working on. So with that, Fatima is actually behind you there at the podium. So she'll present this item and take it away.
Thank you so much. As Chris mentioned, over the past year or so, we have been working with Caltrans to provide the 2019 Freight Mobility Plan. At each of the CFAC meetings, we provide some updates, and we got very helpful comments and inputs from this group. Today, we are at the point that we have several of the chapters of the plan ready. I'm going to talk about Chapter 5, Trends, Issues, and Opportunities today, and after me, Dan Smith, our partners in the team from Toyota Group, he will talk about Chapter 2, California Competitiveness Positions. Throughout the whole plan, our mission was to tell the story of freight in California, to hear from all various sectors and to reflect their concerns and be a good listener and basically tell what does it mean to them. So in this chapter, I'm gonna walk you through maybe not all of the slides that I prepared. This chapter is a result of a detailed research and also talking to more than 20 plus individuals during one-on-one interviews. A lot of you were participated in our interviews. Thank you so much. More than 80 plus individuals participated in our focus group meetings, and also we had about 100 plus online survey responses. So a lot of this material that I'm presenting here is going through the literature and see what's happening out there. Some of the trends that we're talking is not specific to California, it's going national and international, but it has a specific implications to our region. So with the inputs provided from all of you, we were able to put together these materials. The first trend that popped up everywhere was the e-commerce and the significant growth of it during the past decade or so. The share of e-commerce from the retail has been growing, and it's going from, looking at this chart, maybe a little tiny, for the past 17 years, the retail grew from $3 trillion to $5 trillion, where the e-commerce almost go from 0 to 450 million. So it's still a small share of the total retail, but the growth is robust and it's projected to continue. What does that matter for our local regions is the loss of the sales tax and the impact of these online deliveries that's going faster and faster and faster and requires a different type of a logistics system where you need the more fulfillment centers, maybe smaller and more closer to the urban areas, and also more distribution centers. An average distribution centers, maybe it's required a minimum of 1 million square feet of land. So this is a noticeable amount of land required. An average fulfillment centers may vary from 50 to 500 square feet. I put some of these numbers there to see that these are the implications that have on our land use planning, and this is what's the trends going on. So a lot of these retail closures, oops, what did I do? Yeah. A lot of the retail closures, comments that, reports that you have been hearing combined with this change in the land use. Coupled with the faster and faster requirements by the users, we have been seeing a robust growth in air cargo, almost doubled in the past 5 years. It's still very tiny share of our total transportation by tonnage, but it's robust and it's growing. We also see that the concerns about the first and last mile issues regarding the airport access. So airports are in charge of their own development, but the first mile and last mile access to these airports are kind of a fuzzy area. The airports are not, it's not the property of the airport. For the cities, it might be some of them or the Caltrans, but who is providing this capacity to provide the efficient movements for this? We hear a lot of our favorite giant retailers that close. The JCPenney, Macy's closed hundreds of their stores. Gap, Kmart is on the edge of closing or bankruptcy. And this has an impact. The millennials are changing their trends. They're buying more and more online. And even the older generation, they're getting more comfortable of using the websites and online shopping patterns. As a result, we see that 87% reduction in retail space opened in 54 largest U.S. markets. What does that mean? It means the job market has changed. A lot of the sales jobs in the local areas where these facilities are closed are lost. So the impact is not just in the type of the operation of the supply chain and how we access our goods. It has a broader impact on the local communities. To the claim of the giant online retailers, Amazon have opened 19 fulfillment centers in California, and they announced that they have over 17,500 small businesses selling their product on Amazon. So there is a shift between the labor and workforce, and as I state, the challenge again becomes, are we prepared for the education and retraining and training of this workforce moving from one type of jobs to the others? That was on the behavior of how our access to the market has changed. But we have a lot of technological investment in the past. Even in the past 5 or 6 years, there are a lot of things happen that require our attention. My favorite one is this 3D printing. I think it's the most environmentally sustainable types of printing. It might not be very growing as rate as they thought, or the market penetration might not that much, but they're growing at the double the rate that they used to be, even between 2015 to 2017. It goes from 4% to 12%. You can produce almost anything, they say, from tennis shoes to even some materials that requires for the biomedical engineers. What does it do to the manufacturers? You're changing the final commodity movement. Instead, you're having the raw material movement. Raw material transportation is more efficient. They can be transported in more dense, consolidated packages. We're also doing on-demand delivery. So there is no waste. There is no extra transportation from the manufacturer locations to the warehouses to the final retail station. So a lot of consolidation might happen if this 3D printing become more commercial. There is a lot of automations and autonomous and influence of robots and penetrations of the robots in various levels happening. Cobots are the collaborative robots. That looks like to be more popular than the fully autonomous robots. That means the robots are sharing the same workspace as the humans. A lot of the small and medium-sized businesses started to get benefit, and it becomes more and more affordable. So that improved their efficiency, that improved their the way they produce materials and have growing faster. As a result, there is a concern about the workforce, and are these robots are taking our jobs, and are our workforce ready to catch up with these trends. In some areas, there's also concern when we're talking about the autonomous trucks, where it's a kind of a battle. On one side, we have the shortage of truck drivers. On the other side, we might lose some of the existing jobs that about 140,000 something truck driver jobs in California. So this is a two side of the dynamic that the automation helps our industry. It helps efficiency. It reduces some of the emissions and all the negative impacts. But on the other side, we need to work and invest on our workforce to make sure we are growing on the other side. The other popular one was the blockchain, and it's actually being implemented. Port of Long Beach, Port of LA are working with GE. It's in a slow implementation, but it's going. Walmart started to implement blockchain to track all their leafy green products, so that when there is a recall, they don't need to recall the whole batch of sales. They can exactly know where things are. And basically, what does the blockchain do is a secure environment to share data between different entities. As GE mentioned in their report, their most challenge regarding implementing faster, at least at the Port of Long Beach, Port of LA case, is there are many different systems that each of the terminals, the warehouses, the operators, they all have their own type of data storage and operation. Getting them under one umbrella and one integrated system, it's not an easy task. It's also the matter of trust. This entities are competing with each other, and are we able to get them all buy-in? And although it provides efficiency for all of them, it helps reduce the truck traveling time and more efficient moving of containers. But on the other side, you're sharing your information with your competitors, and who knows what happens. So improving the awareness of how these systems work and what's the benefit of them for all of the people involved in this, it will help implementation of the such systems. I mentioned there are various levels of autonomous trucks and automations. There are other states that were more proactive and more open to enable legislations to provide access to fully or partially operating these autonomous or semi-autonomous trucks. In California, we are only allowed for test applications of that. So this has been a promising, and it increased the fuel efficiency and reductions of the emissions for the industry. It also has the challenges on the safety and liability, and so who is going to be responsible if something goes wrong? There was a case of fatal collisions, not regarding trucks, in the 80 passengers in Arizona. So these challenges, before enabling any of these technologies, needs to be think about and be prepared for. The energy. The push for the near zero and zero emission energies was one of the requirements of the previous plan, and also for the 2016 Sustainable Freight Action Plan. They were pushing for more and more use of zero emission and near zero emission equipment. But there are also challenges. There are resistance from the industry because some of these equipments are not commercially at the low-cost competitive price available. It's also the supporting infrastructures. Who is responsible in providing fuel infrastructure adequately? So it's a cycle. The more the people are get into this system, it becomes more and more affordable. So it requires a lot more investment and support from public sector. That's what we hear from the interviews and stakeholder focus to be implemented at a larger scale, so the price become more competitive. There are also renewable gas that more that compete with the diesel, because it can go as far as the regular trucks, and it's also, but it provides the same amount of emission as a natural gas. The cost of the hydrogen fuel cells, and also the issue that they can only go to certain miles. That on average, the report was about 300. So that's the limitation on implementing the and use of more of the hydrogen fuel cell trucks. We also, on the energy trend, we also hear, and Dan will talk about how this energy availability will affect our competitiveness. On 2018, average price per kilowatt in California ranged from 14.6 cents per kilowatt hour to 22. So this is a very large gap. In SoCal Edison, we had a price of 14. In Bay Area, we had a price of 22. And we also, the way the structure of the electric companies are, they penalize you if you use more. And this penalty can go up to 4 times. So you want to have more and more zero emission equipment. That means you're increasing the use of your electricity while you're penalizing for more use of it. So this is sort of the regulations and sort of the structure that we have that needs change if we want to support this zero emission and near zero emission equipment. On-road delivery vehicles is mostly supported by the private sectors. They invest in many different modes. going from hyperloops to drone deliveries to all kinds of high-tech, fast technological improvement. And it's demand-driven, so they invest on it, they respond to the demand for it, and this is going. There's also a push for the marine highways. There have been studies and there have been some research and some pilot programs, but it shows that the lack of the entrepreneurship in the maritime services and the shortage of the demand to such an operation along the M5 or M580 in California, it doesn't seem that one of the trends that is moving on. We also have opportunities for inland port, where it's growing in, where we are lacking the infill areas to provide more support in near Port of Long Beach or Port of LA or Oakland. These inland port opportunities are becoming more and more potentials. So I talked about these trends, and each of them might have benefits and might have potential for each of the sectors in the industry. I want to pass through some of them, and the way we perceive them, if we try to summarize these trends and provide summarize all these trends and their implications for each of the sectors in some infographics. So looking at by each mode, what does these trends meaning? From highway perspective, everything is related to truck driver shortage. And if the truck driver's operation is about 40 to 45% of the cost of the operations, this means a lot. So any increase in efficiency, that's important for the industry. We also, on the other side, have the ELD regulations, the hours of service, and what was the implication of that when it went into the effect for the truck drivers. And if we have the autonomous trucks, do we still have that regulation? Are they different? So these are the things that have not really been thought about and needs the legislations to consider them before these technologies are really become active. For the rail industry, there is a competition for the shared use. And as much as the passenger rail is pushing for the growth, the freight rail using the same infrastructure. So the more passenger rail, it means less opportunity for the freight rail. And as of now, there is not being foreseen that the passenger rail operating on their own facilities. So they are going to continue to share, and coming up with a more innovative and collaborative way of using the infrastructure is the desire for this group. On the marine and the ports, cost of fuel and cost of the operation. Dan will talk more about these items and how this affects some of the niche ports. The larger ports may have the benefit of diversity of various types of industries working with various type of commodities, but the niche ports like Port Hueneme and Port San Diego, where they have specific operators, they might get affected with some of the regulations and the requirements. I mentioned about the air cargo, the first and last mile connectivity and accessibility is becoming more and more important for them. To summarize, for this chapter, we go over 10 trends, and each of these trends were identified for each of the groups of the industry stakeholders and entity users. What does it mean for them? Is it an opportunity for them, or is it a challenge for them, or what can we do, or as a state, what can we do to be prepared and turn these challenges to opportunities? So customers, the final customers and end users of the system, beneficial cargo owners, or whoever creates or aggregate the products, the logistic companies and all the freight transportation industry, the infrastructure capacity, By capacity, I mean any type of infrastructure that support the operation of the goods movement. The operations and the operation over these facilities, the community and the environment, and also the regulatory and the policy impact. So these are, let's call them all the entities in the freight system. And with each of these trends, they might face an opportunity or a challenge regarding them. So as you go closer to the center of this circle, you have the potential more challenge regarding this trend. As you go to the outer rings and larger rings, you have more potential opportunities. And for us to think about is how some of these challenges we need to be prepared and turn them into opportunities. For example, for the growth in population, there is a more opportunity for people to access all goods. There is opportunities for the small businesses to access the online market. But on the other side, you are using the infrastructure more and more and more. So we are going to have more bottlenecks. We're going to have more operational issues. If we're not thinking about them, the capacity of our facilities, the first and last miles, so they all get impacted. On the community and environment, while we are creating new jobs, we are also losing some of the jobs. So how do we plan for them? How do we implement some of the policies to support communities? That is important.
So Fatima, perhaps we have 10 of these, and if you share these long enough, you'll go crazy. So you shouldn't do that.
No,
but because there are 10, I think what we're trying to convey is, there are these different sector players, and all of them are going to face different opportunities and challenges. But if you go back to that list of the 10 challenges that were sort of laid out in the current structure, I think there's something there for everyone as we highlighted these various challenges and opportunities. And I think what we would really like from all of you is to take a very, very close look at this chapter when we circulate that to you and really provide us with some input. And I know, there's an awful lot to absorb here. I mean, we just gave you end-to-end run of the various issues that are facing the industry. And with that come the public policy opportunities for us to influence where we might want to move and what directions we might want to embrace. We really want to use this plan to inform decision makers about the kinds of actions we could take, both at the public level and at the private level, to see how to address these challenges. And they're all, fraught with various issues, but we really want this plan to articulate that clearly. And we need your input on these. Many of you are specific stakeholders in these topics. You're engaged in these issues, and we want to make sure that the plan is reflected and is accurate and hopefully is representative of what we're already doing in this space throughout the state. So I kind of look at this sort of as a tour de force kind of a presentation of what we're trying to accomplish in the plan itself. But we really need to ground truth that from all of you. As you heard, we had a number of stakeholder engagements, lots of interviews, focus groups, et cetera. So I think we're trying to reflect what we heard and what we've seen through the research, et cetera. But at the same time, ultimately, this is what we want to put forth in the plan to articulate these concerns. We want to make sure they're correct. So if you have questions today and concerns, and I see a 10 going up already, let's have that discussion now, and then figure also out how to engage you further in the review and the commenting. Go ahead.
Okay. So you're kind of touching peripherally on a lot of things. We've heard Jessica give a great presentation this morning about the situation that we have here in West Dublin. It's the same situation at the Port of Long Beach, right, where the community is backed up against your freight hub. You have to, through some of the measures that you're implementing here, hopefully improve their environmental situation by changing the fuels, by moving the cargo more efficiently. But I don't see that identified as a major challenge or issue in this plan. Coming at it from our perspective, with the requirements that we have under AB 617, I don't know how that can't be one of the most significant issues that you're going to have to deal with. So I think I've made this point before, but I'm going to keep, that's why I'm here. Right?
That's why you're here,
That's why I'm
and
here.
that's why we posed this. And so I think that's the key, that
This is
oftentimes.
finding the trend, not the issue. So these are the trends.
Well,
that you see.
maybe I was confused because it's issues up on the top.
And then for each of the trends, we identify the issues. So when you go for each of the entities and you write the environmental concerns raised on every item that you have the growth,
Yeah.
right?
So why don't you call it out then specifically as an item that you need to address?
So maybe we could do that. I think it's a fair point, that there is a very distinct trend of really understanding what these community environmental type impacts have been historically and how they need to be addressed. That there has been an equity concern, and we need to call that out as a very specific issue. We certainly have, legal framework in which to do that, but I think it's more important to really understand that it's not just, sort of business as usual, but I mean, there needs to be, an acknowledgement up front that this is not just, emerging, it's been an ongoing issue, and we need to address it head on and highlight that more clearly. So I think that's a fair point.
Yeah, what I think the main point is that you want to show that you've identified that, and as you're moving through this planning process, it's not something you put in the background. You're working so that that's part of your core philosophy, right? And that these measures that you're taking are addressing that.
Yeah, fair point. So do help us articulate that appropriately as well. Other questions on this comments, Jesse? Oh, sorry, Jared. Well,
Okay. Anyway, Garth Hopkins, California Transportation Commission. There's a lot of information there. A couple of things I wanted to touch on is in terms of the technology, I would hope that like the drone delivery or autonomous trucks or something like that. I mean, there's stuff within the short term, 5-10 years or something that looks like it may be feasible and doable. Others, Hyperloop or something. So hopefully you kind of put it in perspective in the document in terms of short-term, long-term.
There is a timeline for some of this.
Great. And to echo, the prior comment in terms of the environmental impacts, that hopefully the document will do that. Also, to see what have been the environmental improvements in terms of the freight industry over the last 5-10 years or something. Also, I know I'm aware CARB is going to be coming out with some regs on new freight, the trailer efficiencies, make them more dynamic and whatnot. Hopefully it'll be touching on that in terms of what are some of the short-term kind of technological improvements that are going to improve or reduce, should I say, the environmental impacts. And then lastly, recently heard like the reuse of Castle Air Force Base and I know George Air Force Base in terms of what are their impacts on goods movement and logistics, supply chain here in California. Hopefully the CFMP is going to touch on those type of issues as well. Potentially could have some big impacts. So anyway, thanks.
Jesse, thanks.
Jesse Marquez, Coast for the Environment. Damien hit a very strategic point. We get referencing AB 617. AB 617 will revolutionize everything in California. I sit on the State Advisory Committee, and we met yesterday. I also sit in one of the 10 pilot projects, Wilmington, Long Beach, and Carson. At this point, all 10 pilot communities have identified their priority concerns. Ports was there, intermodal freight was there, freight transportation corridors are there, and what's going to happen between now and July, all 10 pilot project communities will finish writing their draft community plan on how they will reduce emissions. And I can tell you now from my perspective, I'm not going to accept something that's going to say 10, 15, 20 years down the line. We are going to recommend what we feel are viable, feasible things that can be done in the very short term, the next 5 years. And so while we're busy working on this plan, realize that there's going to be, possibly 100 recommendations coming out of these 10 plans in July. So I would recommend that this organization be able to look at those 10 plans or have staff summarize all those, because there's going to be specific recommendations there that will be part of the implementation. And somehow it's going to have to be done. There's no way to say we can't do it, we're not gonna do it, or we're gonna wait 20, 30 years to do it. That's not gonna be acceptable to any of the communities. So we see this as a golden opportunity to partnership with our local ARB, our local HMDs, and other trade transportation agencies. What is a good solution? And a good solution begins with a phase-in plan. So we're not saying it's gonna happen tomorrow, we know that. But we have to be able to accept a plan that's gonna work, okay, by year 3, we're gonna do this, by 5, we're gonna do this, by 10, we're gonna do this, so that it becomes acceptable to those communities, knowing that there is hope for the future. And that, you've heard the word you mentioned about your, was it DP? Your funding that was approved earlier, DP? Well, same thing in LA County, we do the same thing with our Measure M. So yes, the public supports this, and we will back these type of things because we understand it. So we approved Measure M, which is going to apply over $200 million a year as soon as the current one phases out. But then the public also voted for Proposition, 1B as well. So the public's always there, providing you're talking with us, as equal partners at stake on this.
Good point, Jesse. And I think one of the things we can do, we've been working with ARB staff on some of this as well. I think we should bring back 617 as a discussion item at a future CFAC to kind of talk about the very issues you're talking about. Those plans, what those communities are raising, and really make sure everyone on this committee has a clear understanding of that, and perhaps can also have some input in that. Jacob's tended, I'm sorry, Mike's tended.
Hey, Chris. And just a question on the next slide. I don't know when you had the stakeholder groups. I didn't see a spot for carriers.
We put them all under just the previous, I had a newer version here. We had all on the transportation, logistics, and carriers under the number 3. All carriers, trucking, and 3-party logistics companies under number 3. Whoever provides a moving service.
Okay, I would avoid labeling that as 3PL then, because that's a very, very specific.
I know this is not the last. Yeah, we call them all freight transportation providers. Thanks.
Thank you.
All right, being mindful of time, I know we're on the agenda here, but this is a great conversation. Is there anybody else that has any other comments, particularly to this agenda item? Anybody out there? Okay, thank you all.
Thank you so much. Feel free to email me if you have any further questions. We very appreciate your comments and feedback to that.
Okay. Moving on to the California's Freight Mobility Plan, California's competitive position.
So Dan Smith is here from Tioga Group, who's also part of our CFMP team, and he's going to provide some perspectives on competitiveness. And we've had this discussion here in the past, trying to figure out, given the conditions in California, where we have, as Jesse pointed out, regulatory concerns about cleaning up the industry and community impacts, greenhouse gas emission reductions, we have global trade challenges, et cetera. We really want this plan to articulate what those challenges truly are. You heard Fatima refer several times to jobs and employment. It is largely about that when we talk about economics of the freight industry. We want folks to have good, solid jobs, and there are trends. And so we want to make sure we understand clearly what the freight economy looks like and its competitiveness relative to the rest of the country and the rest of the world. So Dan's here to kind of walk you through how the plan's going to help address that a little bit. We do want your input here as well, so get ready with questions and comments. Dan?
Thank you very much for letting us be part of the meeting. Competitiveness is a growing concern in California for both the public and private sectors. We have a tremendously powerful economy here, but we constantly hear businesses closing, moving out of state, new facilities being built elsewhere. Within the transportation and logistics field, we hear that our ports, trucking firms are losing out to competitors, that California is no longer a competitive option for some kinds of development, and even that the state is anti-business. Caltrans and the transportation field are not ordinarily tasked with economic development, but we suspect there's a linkage between our freight system performance and economic development and our competitiveness. Moreover, the CFMP is not just a Caltrans plan, but really is a state government plan that embraces the responsibilities and the contributions of multiple agencies. So the CFMP needs to address competitiveness and determine what the state can do in the broader freight field. to improve competitiveness or at least arrest its decline. So to do that, we need to start with a high-level view of what competitiveness is, what are we competing for. It's a pretty broad concept, so we thought it would be helpful to clarify some things up in front. The most visible issue is competition for business locations. That means production facilities, distribution facilities, and offices. And we are competing with other states and even other nations in that regard. Businesses within California are also competing for business volume and market share with facilities in those other states and nations. And sometimes with facilities in their own companies. Finally, our ports, our airports, and carriers here are competing for freight transportation business with providers of facilities in other places. So where does freight transportation itself fit in this competitive landscape? Basically, freight transportation customers take capacity and efficiency as a given. So when they look at freight transportation issues, they're almost always looking at shortfalls in some locations, whether it's congestion, high cost, capacity, reliability, whatever, as a handicap in competitive situations. So in a way, there's no way you can get ahead on the basis of freight transportation, but you can fall behind, and that's the danger. Now, what other factors are out there? In CFAC and the other focus groups, individual interviews, and surveys we've taken, some factors come up repeatedly, and Fatima has already referred to some of those. Workforce availability, cost of living here, land and development costs, development time and uncertainty, environmental regulation, and the competing development efforts of other states and nations, and we'll talk about those some. We've been focusing mostly on location decisions. Those received most of the attention that dominated the discussion. There are three kinds of location decisions here. Locating a new facility or business, expanding, shrinking, or closing one that's already here, and allocating business between existing facilities. There are a lot of different factors that go into location decisions. You can go to the literature and find dozens of lists, different priorities, different ways of putting it. This is in rough priority order here. And let's see if this gadget works. Yes, I'll use it up here. There are a lot of things we have to go through for basic feasibility before we ever get to freight transportation. We have to make sure we have access to the market. We need sites with zoning. If there is no access to the market, no sites, if the regulations prevent us from building there, if we can't develop our facility as fast as we need it, freight transportation doesn't count. Good, bad, or indifferent, it's irrelevant. So we need to have feasibility to build or expand the facility where we need it with the workforce, close to our suppliers, and at an affordable cost before we even get freight transportation. So what do we compete for? We compete for new distribution facilities. We compete for expansion of existing facilities. We compete for territory. If we're going to serve the Southwest, are we going to serve it from Southern California, or are we going to split the Southwest territory between the Southern California DC and Arizona DC? Those are different implications for how much business winds up within our borders. And allocation of new distribution territory. If I'm expanding into Utah, do I build a new DC there, or do I serve it from Lathrop? Those are the kind of decisions that are being made. There are levels of distribution facilities. They're all not doing the same thing. For many companies starting out, you start with a single distribution facility, which might be the back end of your factory. As your business grows and your territory grows, you add regional distribution centers and multiple layers of distribution. Fatima talked a little bit about Amazon. Amazon, as of 2017, when we did this, had 29 distribution centers in Southern California alone. Multiple layers, starting with very large regional distribution centers out in the Inland Empire, and cascading through sub-region and even city local for distribution for the prime now facilities. Now, there is a trick here, because California wasn't competing for any of those distribution facilities. All of them are there to serve California customers, and they can't be anywhere else. So that's anchored here. The only one where there's some competition is the yellow one, it's hard to see, right here. That's their import distribution center. So that one does compete with flows from through other ports in other states. But the rest of this is anchored here. So this kind of business that is anchored to California population, California demand, California specific production, we aren't competing for that. That's going to be here. Where we start competing is where we can move to other locations. We've heard from many stakeholders that it's much more costly to build and operate distribution facilities in California. So we went looking for some numbers. This is a 2015 study, so I would not vouch for the accuracy of any one of these numbers at this point. It was done by the Boyd Corporation, but what basically they did is try to model the cost of building and operating the same distribution center in multiple locations. In this case, they're comparing Hesperia and Mira Loma, Apple Valley out toward the Inland Empire, with Casa Grande or Keenan, Arizona. And as it shows here, you can see California has markedly higher labor, electric power, and construction costs than those other states. Those are the things we hear the complaints about. Higher labor here, particularly higher electric power costs. That was meant, Fatima mentioned that it's become a very serious issue as both transportation facilities and distribution facilities use more and more power. We have almost an adverse cost structure in California, which penalizes them for being more electric. Now, there are also issues of workforce behind here. To add some perspective, the median home price in Apple Valley, California is $256,000. You go across the border to Casa Grande and it's $176,000. So the house is $80,000 less. And for somebody who's on distribution center wages, which are close to minimum wages, that's a huge difference. What evens things out at the moment is the shipping costs from Southern California. If you're trying to build an import distribution center, you probably want it near the port. You want to minimize the drayage, reliability, and other issues there. Boyd, when they did the study, only included the inbound costs, so the outbound costs are going to depend upon the market you serve. Now take a look at this one. This compares Patterson, Tracy, and Victorville with Miramar, Florida, and Cordele, Georgia. Again, we've got very high labor, power, and amortization costs, which include land and construction. Property and sales taxes still vary because they are different in other states, and some states are higher than California. But again, it's definitely cheaper to build and operate these facilities in the Southeast than in California. Median home prices for Tracy is $467,000. For Miramar, Florida, it's $310,000. In Cordele, Georgia, $198,000 would see the same house. So you can see what that implies for workforce, labor costs, etc. Now, in this case, those totals are lower in Florida and Georgia because they have their own ports. If you are trying to serve the South and Southeast in the United States, you can save $1 million to $1.5 million annually by locating that distribution center in Florida or Georgia than in Southern California or Northern California. That's a lot of money. It's more than I make in a week. Now, we know that the California ports and Pacific Coast ports as a whole have been losing import market share to the Atlantic coast. The issue has been hashed out endlessly in the trade press, and there's lots of reasons. I'd be happy to go into any of these reasons in response to questions, but one of them here, I'll try it again, is the cost of locating the distribution centers here versus in those other states. But part of that is being driven by the maturation of inland supply chains and the migration of not only distribution, but manufacturing to the Southeast. 20 years ago, many major importers brought their Asian goods into Southern California and distributed from Southern California to the whole country. The establishment of double-stack rail services, practice of transloading imports, and the dramatic growth of imports from China all boosted Southern California's market share. But as import volumes grew, major importers, particularly the real retail chains, found they had enough volume now to support multiple ports of entry and multiple distribution points. Remember years ago trying to understand this, I and some colleagues spent an hour and a half on the phone with Walmart's distribution executives explaining this whole process. 20 years ago, Walmart did not have enough imports going into Georgia or Florida to support a separate import distribution center there. So it all went through Southern California. Now, in fact, 10, 15 years ago, they found they did have enough volume going into Georgia. So Georgia can become its own distribution point. That's changing for many, many importers. The lower distribution costs in the Southeast states and the more recent expansion of the Panama Canal have encouraged this trend. So that means a lot of the import growth is going elsewhere, and it's contributing to that loss of market share here. Now, California has higher trucking costs than competing states, driven mostly by higher fuel costs, but also the higher cost of meeting clean truck requirements. This is data from the ATRI, the American Transportation Research Institute, which is the research arm of the American Trucking Association. They do this every year. Unfortunately, they break out the West. California is in the West. They don't separately break out California. So we're trying to find some data that's more specific to California. But the most striking thing here is the fuel cost that I referred to. It's real and it's substantial. Even taking ultra-low sulfur diesel across all states, so you don't have different fuel types, it's 24% more in California than on the national average. That is a big cost increment. It does mean that drivers that travel to and from California fuel up in Nevada, Oregon, and Arizona wherever possible. They drive into California on Nevada fuel, and they drive out of California on Nevada fuel. But that does mean if you're based in California and you are fueling in California, you have a concrete disadvantage compared to your competition based on buying fuel in other states. Now, another thing we've noticed that the economic development efforts of other states are pulling business out of California. We are being outspent and outdone. This is a report that we found which shows the dollars spent on economic development, state economic development, per business located in the state. Now, California has an awful lot of businesses, but some of those other states do as well. These are 2016 numbers. I understand that, in fact, GoBiz may have taken additional budget hits since then, but I'm not a state budget expert, and there's probably a better analysis to be done here. But the numbers are a little shocking. On average, according to the study, California spent $173 per existing business on attracting new business. That number in Georgia was $758. The number in South Carolina, where the Port of Charleston is 10 times the amount that California is spending. And there is not a direct, always equation between spending money and getting results, but the results have been there. If you look at the new distribution centers and manufacturing facilities opened in Georgia and North Carolina, it is a very, very long list. And we went and looked at a couple of specific economic development initiatives. The one in Georgia is called the Port Linked Economic Development Initiative. If you take your phones or your laptops right now and you go to the Port of Savannah's website, you will find on the Port's website links to economic development. They will take you on the Port's website to specific buildings up for sale right now. So you don't even have to go off the Port's website. They will take you from a casual inquiry to a dead-on facility. And the Port will give you a tax credit for locating in Georgia, directly linked to your volume through the Port of Savannah. So the Port is subsidizing the Port of Savannah by giving tax credits for new business locations. And that's what we're up against. We have nothing comparable in California. British Columbia, we've lost a lot of market share, discretionary cargo, intermodal cargo, to the British Columbia ports of Vancouver and Prince Rupert. They have what's called the Asia Pacific Gateway Initiative. It links city, port, regional, and federal development of infrastructure to support the ports. It has an extensive job force development program and a research arm. It's been going on for a couple of decades. I sat in one of their presentations to the British Columbia Trucking Association back in 2012. I was the only American in the room, and I felt like I was witnessing a plot to take over the world. And I thought I should get back to this and warn the U.S. before it's all gone. And in fact, it's been going. They are basically pulling discretionary cargo. They took much of the market share of Seattle Tacoma. They're now pulling vessel calls and intermodal business away from LA and Long Beach. So these are coordinated, well-funded, long-term development initiatives. And this is what we're competing with. So if I'm the Port of Oakland, I am not competing with the Port of Savannah. I am competing with the entire state government of Georgia and of North Carolina and South Carolina. So we do not have anything remotely resembling a level playing field. So bottom line, are we competitive? No. We are attracting and retaining business and business activities that must locate here to serve California or to draw on our resources or to cluster with a high tech sector. For those sectors, freight mobility is not a factor in their decision. They may choose where in California to locate, closer to the freeway, closer to the port, closer to the airport. But if you're serving California customers, you probably need to be in California. So that's freight transportation is not a big factor in whether or not California gets business that is anchored here. We are losing business and businesses that can locate elsewhere. To put it bluntly, if you don't need to be in California, you don't want to be in California. If land costs, energy costs, labor costs, and development time are factors in your decision, California loses out. Freight mobility is significant, but we really do not have an advantage on freight mobility except for our proximity to Asia. So what can we do? Freight mobility initiatives may not be a decisive factor, but they help. And a lot of what we heard was focused specifically on bottleneck, specific locations within the state that are causing cost and reliability problems. Clearly, we need to be doing a great deal more with economic and workforce development. The other states are basically eating our lunch. Our business climate has a very bad reputation, and we should be doing things to look more receptive. Our environmental and building regulations and approval process are major targets of industry complaints. I don't know if this state or municipalities ever want to back off on things. I don't think so. But we may want to find ways to streamline the process so that people can get a decision in a timely fashion. Utility costs are big barriers and are specifically barriers to meeting zero emission goals in freight facilities. Whether it is accurate or not, there's also a perception out there. There are regulations, specifically our environmental regulations, change too often, and people talk to them about being capricious or arbitrary. I don't think that's true, but that's the perception that's out there. I would say that some of the critics have themselves to blame because they often don't participate in the process, but that doesn't solve the problem. In a sense, the overriding issue we're seeing through these things is managing trade-offs. The critics out there, the industry increasingly views Californians as left-wing tree-hugging unionists. Now, I am a left-wing tree-hugging unionist, but yes, I'm sorry, Chair, we didn't notice. And I want the best possible living conditions and air quality for my children and their children. But I also want those children to have jobs, good jobs. And if my community is being ringed by factories and distribution centers, I want them to be live ones, not dead ones. So if we want those jobs, if we want to keep those factories and distribution centers operating, And if we want more jobs here, we probably are going to have to do some shifting of the needles as a state. So this overview by no means doesn't answer all the questions. I think it's a start with some conversations we need to have. With that, happy to take questions or discussion.
So Dan tells a happy tale here, right? So I think this is part of the challenge, is our ability to articulate this issue within the state and how to talk about the economics, the employment, the environmental benefits, et cetera, in a way to really articulate what we're trying to achieve. So we also need your assistance in framing this, making sure that the plan actually articulates this in a meaningful way that can drive public policy. So we'll take some comments and questions.
Hold on a minute. I do need to remind you from our awesome technical team in the back that could you please state your name and which agency you're representing when you're speaking for the notes. Thank you.
So Andre Freeman from CARB.
Great, thank you. So Andre Freeman, Air Resources Board. This was a great presentation. I've seen this one before. It's great. It's the second time still. I think it would be really helpful to know how all this information is going to be integrated into the CFMP. Is it going to be put in as an informational, educational source? And can you identify if it is going to trickle down to kind of advise guidance, recommendations that are coming out of the Freight Mobility Plan? Similar question for the freight investment strategy discussion that we'll have. How does all this information kind of trickle down to individual actions down at the ground level that will happen?
Yeah, so actually that's a good question for the CFAC as a whole. How would you like it to be represented? There's a number of different ways to do it. You know, we could put specific policy drivers and recommendations into the plan and frame it that way. It could just be there as informational and just let it sort of hang there in midair and say, you know, we're not competitive, so there it is, without any specific recommendations or actions. So, you know, the plan should be implementable. So I would suggest we should have some actions, but we do want your input on that as well. Jesse.
Jesse Marquez, Coalition for a Safe Environment in Los Angeles. I want to compliment the Taylor Group as well as the Fair Peer Group. These are two of the best studies I've ever read regarding transportation because they were very focused to the actual problems and then identifying what those problems were and then what are various alternatives and details related to it that we have to take into consideration. But I do want to correct one point that was mentioned. That was regarding California's environmental requirements as being, you know, a stumbling block to get through. That's not really the case. From our perspective, is that it was a failure to prepare a proper EIR with all the necessary assessments and the failure to apply appropriate mitigation to address those impacts. If those two things have been done, then it would be a smooth process of going through the public comment period and in a timely manner. Because I'm involved in lawsuits of sequent nature, such as the BNSF gig, where, you know, get lost in court. So we stopped BNSF Railroad new intermodal facility. But if they had complied and did a proper EIR with the proper assessments and with the best mitigation that the public and communities wanted, it would have been approved. So it's not our fault that they did not prepare a proper EIR, CEQA document, and all the required documents to go with it. Which is just a note, prepare good documentation, then there will not be opposition from the communities if it's acceptable to our community lifestyle and social needs.
Can I respond to that real quickly? Because in an important sense, Jesse's absolutely right. Now, what's out there is a perception, and the perception isn't always reality. The perception is that, and everybody has a tale to tell about a facility or something that got stuck for multiple years. The process is difficult. There are differences of opinion clearly about what the EIR should look like and so forth. What we hear most of all is that it creates a form of uncertainty for them. They don't necessarily know how to do it right the first time. And anything we can do to provide clarity, to bring parties in sooner in the process rather than 2 years after the thing is started, anything we can do to make the process clearer, quicker to get a decision, whether the decision is yes or no. They want a decision sooner. Because, Georgia will start construction for them while we're waiting. And that's the difficulty. It's that perception on, I can have a facility up and running in Georgia before I finish my California EIR. Whether or not that is true, that's the perception out there.
So just in running down the list that you have here, I think if I was on the other side of this, looking at this plan, and I was in the California State Legislature, or I was looking, at it from where would I invest my money? Could you, off this list, would you pick one thing that would be, or could we rank what would be most impactful in terms of changing the competitive edge here?
I would point to two things, one of which we've come up repeatedly, which is the electric power. That was not as big an issue 10, 15 years ago as it's become now. We're hearing about that all the time. Whether you are talking about power for Amazon robots, or you're talking power for zero emissions equipment at a port or a rail facility, that is absolutely critical. The second thing I would point to is actually the economic development program, which besides driving specific facility developments and so forth, also drives the perception of California as a difficult place to do business. We need, in a sense, we need to decide how friendly we want to become and put our money behind it.
So just as a general comment, I think that's something you'd want to emphasize in this plan as you bring it forward. You want to, those are two things that you think are most impactful. I think as a policymaker, someone who's going to take action on this, you're going to want to point those things out and then point out the specifics of what you would do to change the policy. Obviously, on the first, the electrical issues is going to be pretty difficult to solve, but a lot of folks in this room have seen our famous duct curves. We have power, we're charging folks too much for it, and that's because of the electrical rate structure. So there's definitely some work for folks here to do with our colleagues even at the state level in terms of having that discussion. And this is something that could be pointed out in that plan. I think it furthers both the environmental and economic goals of California. Mike? I got to push the red button.
Green. All right, Michael Cono, LA Metro. Thank you very much for this presentation. And from the very beginning, when we started talking about the goals for the CFAC, the economic competitiveness issue was front and center. It's easily lost sometimes in terms of all the different competing desires to see what this plan does produce. LA Metro and our area, we know the impact that competitiveness has on our economy, on our workforce, on our jobs available, and essentially our economic future. So the more blunt this section is in terms of leaving very strong recommendations and essentially asking for action, I would think the better. I think we're too subtle and nuanced about it. It will just become ineffective over time. There should be a sense of accountability next refresh following, did these things get fixed? If there's legislation that comes out, it should be juxtaposed to whether or not it embraces these principles or if it actually goes against these principles. This needs to be not just informational, but also should be driving our policy discussion at the local, state, and regional levels. So hopefully we'll be strong. It's easier to be strong and then back off a little bit as needed versus trying to ramp it up at the end. There are so many things here that are important for us to be discussing beyond just how many billions of dollars can we put into different specific projects. And I think we would focus very much on infrastructure, which is incredibly important, but this is talking about targeting infrastructure as well as policies that make the infrastructure worthwhile. So I think this is, I would hope this will be as strong as possible. I would hope that the governor's office, whether it's GoBiz or whatever it becomes, would take this up as a mantra to pursue.
Yeah, and I think this is one of the reasons we want to bring these two items to you first before we start sort of talking about infrastructure investments and priorities and things like that, really to help frame what that conversation should be about. Because we do tend to focus on certain infrastructure investments as sort of the primary purpose behind the plan, and it is a key purpose, but it is not the only thing that we should focus on. So thank you for that feedback.
Comment over here, Thor.
Okay.
Thank you again for the presentation. This is Darwin Musavi from the State Transportation Agency. I just wanted to build off your point about framing some of this. I would caution and be careful in terms of if this is put into the plan, how we do frame these issues. To me, like the vendor mentioned, a lot of these issues are currently framed as the perception side, although a lot of them are tied to realities. I think we need to make sure, be careful to frame these as how can we constructively address these issues that align with current state goals and build on those. Like for example, I heard some good examples of, instead of getting a trade-off between environmental livability goals and economic and employment goals, how do you address the energy constraints and issues that we still find valuable in the state to meet in low and zero emission goals? How do you address meeting those by supporting that industry or working through the complicated constraints in that industry versus setting up kind of competing interests through the plan with other stakeholders?
Should be green.
Kerry Garrett, Port Los Angeles. Obviously, the first one is, primary purpose of the CFNP. I think economic development is very challenging because obviously it comes down to the dollars and whether it's reduced tax revenue for the state because of tax credits or other types of funding for programs. Ultimately, the challenge there is to get the legislature and the governor's office to agree to something like that. So I think that probably is well intended, but I think that's more of a challenge. Now, AB 371, which is the Frazier's bill on competitiveness in the freight sector, actually can help address some of these things and inform future plans the next update in 5 years. But I think we shouldn't, be too naive about how much that can go into this overall plan. I think the key would be the freight mobility initiatives, knowing that obviously all the existing rules and regulations and impending rules and regulations by CARB and the basin control districts around the state are identifying the standards and the rules for the freight industry. And obviously that's going to be handled over the next 10, 15 years. So I think the emphasis really needs to be in the actual freight mobility. On the energy side, obviously, the ports are working closely with California Energy Commission and CARB and our control districts on use of GRF funds, and I think that'll continue, which is good. It'd be ideal if more funding were going to these programs as opposed to some of the other, I think, less meritorious programs that supposedly reduce greenhouse gases. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you.
Frank Rivera is the Governor's Office of Business and Economic Development. Couple comments. Dan, thank you for your presentation. Dan appeared at our economic competitiveness workforce and labor force working group several weeks ago. Yeah. Thank you for doing that. It's pretty much the same presentation. Couple things is, while Dan paints this dire picture, I do want to say that there are a lot of positives. Number one, just going down your list, Dan, in terms of freight mobility initiatives, we have SB1. I think that's something very positive that the state is doing. As far as workforce development, the governor has created a task force or a commission that's going to take a look at workforce and how we move forward into the future. So that's also very positive. And just working at GoBiz, I've been there to the Brown administration and I'm still there now. We get calls every day, every week from multiple businesses that want to move to California or want to expand in California. So I think it's not all as dire as you're painting it, because while some of that ideas exist about us being anti-business, if you sat at my desk and the desks at GoBiz and we deal with businesses every single day that want to move to California, you'd see a different picture. So my point is this, and also on the environmental and side, while we can't change that per se, those are things that oftentimes occur at the local level, and it's sort of a work in progress. CEQA, oftentimes developers point to that as being something that's not good, but more and more I see it as businesses are just wanting some clarity, and that's what they need going forward, predictability, and oftentimes they don't get that because the way CEQA is established, anybody can file a lawsuit on CEQA, and as you know, Dan, CEQA lawsuits take a long time, and they're very expensive. And I think maybe some clarity, as you mentioned, and some predictability on that front would be a good thing. But then we also have an economic competitiveness through the Sustainable Trade Action Plan. We are working on that. We've hired Jen Giuliano from USC. She's overseeing that work, and we have a couple of years left on it. It's a long-term process, but we're taking a look at how we can manage the competitiveness of the freight industry as we move forward into sustainable freight economy. And part of that is workforce development. So we're taking a look at those, and that's also a positive. We're moving in that direction. So while I see what you're doing here, and I think it's important to point these items out, and I think some of the ports and trucking companies and so forth will say that there are problems. I think there's also a plus side. On the environmental side, if you actually take a look at what the ports have done historically to bring down emissions, they've done a major job on bringing down emissions. And what remains to do are maybe the last 10%, which is probably the most difficult and the most expensive to do. But I think there are a lot of positives that the economy has seen, and in fact a lot of the green jobs that we're seeing are being developed are focused on meeting our climate challenges, and so there's a lot of growth in green jobs, and companies that want to do business in California. With respect to trucking, take a look at Tesla and the zero emission trucks that they're coming out with, as well as Ford, and I can just go on and name just a lot of startup companies that are starting to grow and develop. So while we have these challenges, there are also a lot of spin-off jobs that are being created, and industries that are growing as a result of this. We're taking a look at more at our wind power as well. There's a lot. I'm working with Port of Humboldt now, and they're looking to develop a wind farm, 25, 30 miles off the coast of Humboldt. Having 140 turbines to generate electricity, and that's just one example of how our challenges are helping us go into other directions that will also create jobs. And so I think that's also a positive. There's so many positives that are occurring in the economy right now that isn't captured by some of these bullet points. I just think it's important to understand that there are a lot of positives, and I don't think it's as dire as you're pointing them out to be overall. Yes, there are some problems, I will agree with you. But I think on balance, I think we need to understand that there are a lot of positives, and maybe some of that can be built into your analysis as well. I don't know if you've taken a look at some of the positives. You know, we are the fifth largest economy in the world. And we do actually have some segments of our economy that are growing. They're just growing by leaps and bounds. And yes, we're going to have to take a look at our freight mobility aspect of these industries. But again, there are a lot of positives in the economy, and I don't want this document to just frame a lot of negatives and just take a look at how negative this is, because I think there are a lot of positives coming out of it. And that's the point I wanted to make.
I think I would contrast this as an outside view. This is what we're hearing from the transportation and logistics industry and the manufacturing industry. One of the issues here is that the outside picture of California is not balanced. And I agree, absolutely. We need to get the information about the opportunities out here. It isn't getting out. People from outside California are not seeing that story, and there's a challenge to tell that story.
And on that point, and I missed it, and that is through the Sustainable Freight Action Plan, there is an action 6B, that is asking us to take a look at and working with the industry and state agencies to develop a marketing program for the freight industry, and we're just starting to work on that. And that's in fact one of our positives coming forward out of the Sustainable Freight Action Plan, and that is what we're looking to do is tout the great infrastructure that we have, our great ports, the great freeway access. We have a lot of great access by air, and by the way, look at our climate, and we do have a lot of educated labor force. We're not telling that story. We have governors coming from Texas and Florida and trying to take away our business. Fortunately, that hasn't resulted in much activity, although it resulted in a lot of press. And so we will be telling this story, and I absolutely agree with you, Dan. We have to tell that story. We've got the entree to do that, and AB 371 also focuses on that aspect as well. So we are going to ramp that up, and we will be telling a story very soon.
So just on that point real quick, Dan, I don't want limited time, et cetera, but let's make sure we get with Frank and do that, because I know where you're coming from relative to this, but we need to reflect this broader vision and what we're trying to accomplish in the positive side. So I think we can balance that out the way we present that in the plan. So we can talk about the good, we can talk about the challenges, and sort of level that out a little bit. So
yeah, there is certainly more balance in the chapter
yeah.
than there is just in the presentation. But the more information we can get on that I can build into the report, we want to make sure that's there, because that stuff just isn't as known as it should be known.
This is a great conversation, and we're going to keep going. Chris has assured me he'll get us to lunch, so I do want to continue some of these comments. I do see some intent up. So, Michael.
So just a quick follow-up on this, and thank you very much for the comments you made. The thing that strikes me is just simply the divide between maintaining the movement of freight for the customers and businesses and the needs that are location-specific to California that happen to be here, that are captured here. Some might say they're hostage here, depending on which side you are on that, but the idea is how do we improve the movement of freight for that need that has to be located here, or even capturing more of the economic activity here to support our businesses. The other part is the discretionary, and that's actually a question for where does the state want to go in terms of how competitive do we want to be? Is it a given that we want to be pulling in as much discretionary cargo through the ports and through our, through California, or is it acceptable to let it go elsewhere because the cost to try to compete for that is too high, and the cost for the state is a policy objective. So I think I don't know what the answer is to that. I know we talked about that out in the county in terms of how to make sure our ports are competitive and give them every advantage they can have. Obviously, we can't take every container that wants to come into the United States through the ports in California, but where are we aiming for? If we don't have a goal for what we want to try to capture, then we're not going to be able to set objectives and policy recommendations that will get us there. And then we'll just be satisfied with, what we already have because people need to do business in California versus
this issue with Georgia.
And real quick, I'm glad you raised that issue because that has been resonating with us for a long time, and it's very hard for us at sort of state level to articulate that. So, it does need to kind of come from the industry to sort of articulate that a little bit. Because ultimately, from a public policy perspective, you're absolutely right. You could simply be serving the needs of Californians, and the discretionary cargo can go somewhere else. What are the economic ramifications of that? What does that actually mean to the states? Job growth and economic vitality, et cetera. So Frank, I don't know if you want to speak to that.
Just quickly, through the Stable Freight Action Plan, and through Jim Giuliano from USC, we're working with the industry to establish a goal. What is the target for economic competitiveness? But before we got there, we had to figure out what is economic competitiveness? How do you measure? What are the metrics? And so we're going through that exercise so that we could ultimately come up with a target. And as you know, as Fran Inman always loves to say, it's a system of systems, right? And so you have trucking, you have ports, you have rail. So how do we identify a target? So we're working through that process. Hopefully by June we will have a target, or maybe a suite of targets, perhaps. And from there, that will hopefully, I don't know the timing of this project, but I don't know how we build that in, but that's what we're hoping to have. And we're absolutely working with the industry. The industry is guiding that process.
Matt Davis with Port Milford. I appreciate the discussion here and certainly the work and the partnership that we have with the governor's office. And I think that, not to in any way contradict any of the statements, but to echo some of them that have already been made. The presentation that I think Tioga gave that we saw prior did actually have a lot of data points that were not anecdotal. And I think that, if we're going to incorporate some of the policy proposals in CFMP, it would be really good to really triage them, what are anecdotal, because I don't think we can market our way out of a perception if there are actual utility costs that are higher here, workforce or labor costs that are higher here. And I think from a policymaker's perspective, again, anecdotes are great to provide color, but they're not really great at providing a framework for action and how we actually would determine what is a pathway that we want to take. So I think it would be helpful with Tioga if you could try to maybe put a little bit of a finer point on what data points that we have just to support some of the directions that have been pointed out, and which are really more sort of feelings, which are great, but I don't really think have a legislative or policy making form.
Very valid.
Yes, one last comment. The Sunday before Christmas last year, I was at my 31-year-old son's house, and a package was delivered to him. He had ordered it through Amazon. He had signed up with Amazon Prime, which is free delivery in 2 days. And I asked him, well, how many things do you buy? Well, probably about 90% of my stuff is cheaper online, and it's free delivery in 2 days. You should try it, Dad. So in January, I decided to keep track and go online and see what I could do. And so I ordered 10 things between like January and the end of February. Out of the 10 things, one item could not be delivered in 2 days because it was a cabinet heavy, so it took a week. But it was free delivery. But that same cabinet, if I ordered it anywhere in LA, was a $50 to $75 delivery charge. So it was still cheaper for me to be on the Prime with Amazon to get it. Of the other 9 items, one was not delivered in 2 days. It was delivered on the 3rd day. But the other 8 were cheaper, online, and actually delivered in 2 days, whether it got 7 days a week, regardless if it was a Saturday or Sunday. And that was really an eye-opener for me to have my son educate me, and then for me to try it to see how it worked. But that is how I see reality now. So whatever we're going to master plan, that is the reality.
Thank you. So now that we've been meeting for 2 hours, we've had some folks show up, and one thing I noticed was not on the agenda that we missed was introductions. So 2 hours into the meeting, let's have some introductions before we move on to the next item. Once again, I'm Ryan Derby. I'm filling in for Coco Crescenio as the chair for this meeting. I do apologize we didn't have introductions listed on the agenda, but we're going to do it now. So, my bad.
Michael Cano from the Goods Movement Division at Los Angeles Metro.
Darwin Musavi, Special Advisor to the Secretary at the State Transportation Agency.
Red button.
Yes, the representative Cal Chamber, and new this year handling energy, environmental, and transportation issues for Cal Chamber. So thanks for having me.
My name is John Berger. I'm the planning director at the San Francisco International Airport. Nick Kendall, representing the California Shoreline Railroad Association. Currently work for San Francisco Bay Railroad.
I'm Mary Gilbert, Executive Director of the Council of San Benito County Governments, here representing the California Rural Counties Task Force.
Danny Breen, Deputy Air Pollution Control Officer, Bay Area Air Quality Management District.
Don Chesterly, California Transportation Commission.
And Kurt Hopkins, California Transportation Commission.
Jesse Marquez, Coalition for Safe Environment, a nonprofit environmental justice community in Wilmington, a community in Los Angeles.
Frank Ramirez, Governor's Office of Business and Economic Development. I work in the Business Movement and Sustainable Trade area.
Kyle Pratt from the California Energy Commission's Fuels and Transportation Division. I'm here in place of Wendell Krell, who is a normal participant on my team.
Andre Freeman from the California Air Resources Board. Kurt Cartwright, Director of this movement for Los Angeles.
Dave Jenkins, California Highway Patrol, representing Chief Chris Childs.
Teresa Downgo, Port of Long Beach, taking the place of Allison Young.
I'm Adam Nolting, representing the Metropolitan Transportation Commission.
Matt Davis with Port of Oakland.
Mike Jacob, Pacific Market Shipping Association.
Carlo Cruz, representing Sierra Club, thanks for
You are who?
I'm still Chris.
Okay, thanks everybody. Chris, you have 75 minutes for a, well, you have 45 minutes for a 75 minute item.
Don't worry.
I know you'll handle that. And you are in the most important time slot of the day.
Yeah, can I be before lunch?
Right,
So
before
pay
lunch.
close attention. For those of you who need a bio break, feel free whenever you need to do that. So this item in particular is one that we brought to you several times. It is really a part of the plan that's very important, which is this investment strategy and project list that we're talking about including in the plan itself. And so I want to remind you what we told you in the past and what steps we've taken, and then talk a little bit about some next steps that we're recommending following. So part of the objective here was to develop this list of projects based on the needs and really to articulate that as part of the plan. And the purpose is a key component of the plan, actionable freight projects over the next 10-year period. And the idea was to utilize the methodology that the subcommittee had worked on that we've been kind of running past you. And we want to kind of highlight to you today where that's gotten us so far. If you recall, we're talking about the investments that the state can make relative to the available funds in different funding programs. Under SB1, we've got the Trade Corridor Program, the Solutions to Congested Corridors Program as well as the Local Partnership Program. These are all eligible programs under SB1 where freight type investments could be made. We did not put in here other fund sources because obviously there's others in play, but these are the ones that are largely discretionary programs that are administered by the Commission and would allow key projects to be funded. We're also acknowledging here the fact that we're commingling some of the state funds with federal funds. The federal program is the National Highway Freight Program. Notice that there's about $500 million available here. We've already essentially programmed that funding capacity given the previous authorization under the FAST Act. And we're assuming going forward that a similar reauthorization would make available roughly a similar amount of money over the next 5-year period. So for each fund type under SB1, we've highlighted those funds and we've highlighted those federal funds as well. So over that 5-year program, we're projecting a fairly robust amount of dollars that can be invested, as much as $4.25 billion. So that's really what we're talking about. And the idea here is to make sure we clearly can articulate what are those key freight investments that we want to make over time. So at past CFACs, we've kind of discussed this with you, this need, this opportunity to articulate this, and really how to ultimately articulate that also to the Commission in terms of what the plan calls for as key priorities, and the fact that the CFMP has to include, and we have that under the current plan, how those federal funds are being used. That's a fundamental requirement under the CFMP. And a big part of it is to help inform the commission about also how to leverage the CFMP and what it espouses and aspires to do to guide the guideline development that is undergoing, that's happening right now for the next round of TSEP funding, so that we're sort of all synced up. So we've had an investment strategy subcommittee that was formed, and many of you volunteered for it. Thank you very much. We had 2 meetings at the end of January and then again in March. We initially discussed the various methodologies and criteria to include. One of the keys there was how to include more sustainable freight type projects that are not necessarily articulated in some of the regional plans. We agreed to a methodology and some direction to move forward. And we had essentially a call for projects to facilitate that through our districts at Caltrans. At the March meeting, we actually walked through the draft list of projects, and it became pretty clear that there were some shortcomings, and we sought some additional approaches and direction. Key was to identify more multimodal projects. We had a significant number of highway projects identified, and we had relatively few sustainable freight projects identified. So that was a key concern on our part, that we want to make sure that the list is holistic, that it's really inclusive of everything we want to do. So one of the things that we asked at the time was each district to work with its MPO and RTPA staff to really identify what these key projects are. Largely, they should be contained in the regional transportation plans today. We messaged that they should really be in the constrained plans, recognizing that constrained plans typically assume a variety of fund sources would become available. We also talked about that they must sort of fall into some key timelines here. We really wanted to focus on near-term projects within the next 5 years, something within the next 10 years, and then things that were probably beyond that, out in 2030 and beyond. We talked about a freight definition, which I'll get to here in a second, and we also talked about the alignment in the existing freight system as it's identified, and then ultimately how those projects should be aspiring to achieve these sustainable freight action plan principles that we've also identified as being pretty key. And so lots of criteria here. And it's been a little bit of a challenge to get those projects included. So here's the freight definition. This is the freight definition that we've adopted essentially in the 2014 plan. I think we've largely agreed that we don't need to haggle about changing this definition. It is inclusive, and so long as a project in some manner, shape, or form can ping against this definition, we can consider that a freight project. But beyond that, we need to be clear that it really should fall on the National Highway Freight Network if we can manage to do that. That doesn't mean every project has to be on there, but we want to certainly be in alignment with that. We also recognize that there are key ports of entry in the state, whether those be airports, seaports, or borders. There's lots of infrastructure needs there. We wanted to make sure that we're capturing all of those. The emphasis on rail and rail investments. Where are those and what kinds of intermodal type facilities are we talking about? Maritime improvements in particular, not necessarily just ports of entry at ports, but also a marine highway type concept, things like that. And then first last mile challenges, sort of the more community-based freight infrastructure needs that aren't necessarily always articulated in all of the plans. So this is part of the conversation, and then here's the eye chart of everything we espouse to try to do from the Sustainable Freight Action Plan. There's 12 principles here. When you read through these, I think these are high-level items that I think we can all generally agree are good to do, and we want to be in alignment with these, and some projects are going to do a better or lesser job of achieving some of these things. So you can see, relatively complicated. So when we applied all of these notions, we wound up getting from the districts about 1,200 projects, and those 1,200 projects broken down into various categories here. Essentially, 80% of those were on the state highway system, and about 20% of them were essentially what we at Caltrans often refer to as off-system. And we were concerned about that mostly because we wanted to make sure that the projects are really truly reflective of what's in the RTPs. When we broke this down a little bit further and we looked at sort of near-term needs versus longer-term needs, we had a large percentage of projects listed, more than half, with no specific completion year. About 15% of those projects were beyond 2035, and relatively few, sort of 20-25% of the projects were sort of more near term, what I would call the more fully baked variety. And so that gave us some additional pause, that are we really capturing the right projects, and are we capturing the right timelines? And I think we generally came to the conclusion, maybe not, and we need to do a better job of clarifying what these key priorities truly are. And so, at the top here, as I mentioned, that this came out of the initial process. We applied these key criteria. We got 1,200 projects. I've mentioned the shortcomings. And I think what we're keying up now is in the bottom green, is this need to address more coordination with partners, more multimodal and more sustainable freight projects. And we really need to go back out and verify this list. We need to make sure that the timeframes are correct. And then we probably also need to apply some screening criteria, some screening metrics. I'll get into that here in a little bit. And then help with this notion of identifying these funding priorities that would ultimately lead to an additional subcommittee meeting that we want to have, hopefully early in May. Now, I should also just sort of message here that we've grappled greatly with this whole notion of a freight priority list in the plan period. I think it's fair to say that I've gotten an earful from a number of you about the difficulty of sort of identifying key freight projects and including them on a list when, at a regional planning level, at a regional planning agency level, you might be updating your RTP, you might be considering new projects, emerging projects, you might be thinking about new things that were not in your prior plan that really don't quite have a place yet, new technologies, things like that. And it's very difficult at a staff level to pick up new things and include them in a list when they're not sanctified by your own committees and your own board. So we recognize that as ever-changing environment in which we do transportation planning, that it's kind of hard to capture all these projects. The flip side of that is that folks really do want to know what our priorities are, and I'll just message on a few of those. At the federal level recently, there's been sort of a call for infrastructure projects at the congressional level to really ask the delegations essentially asked, why don't you please tell us what you might need for reauthorization so we can address that and include that, either because we put language in the bill to make sure the right projects get funded, or perhaps we actually articulate specific projects that should be funded, especially if we get away from doing discretionary programs and do more formulaic type projects. Maybe we can call some things out. And California doesn't really have a single list of projects that you can easily pull off the shelf and say, here you go, congressional delegation. These are the 50 most important projects in the state, and if you find us money for these, we'd all be very happy. So that's one aspect on the federal side. On the state side, as the commission determines how to utilize and program those TSEP funds, it would be nice if they also had a universe of projects that they understood are really syncing up with the overall state's freight vision. And that there isn't 1,200 projects to choose from, but that there's a narrower universe of projects to choose from. And this is where the commission also needs to grapple with what kind of metrics to use to choose projects. What's an appropriate freight project, and how do we know one freight project moves the needle more than another freight project? And what kinds of evaluation criteria should we really use for that? And we've grappled with this too. That's where the apply the screening metrics comes in. And we've talked with my team about, if we took this universe of projects that have been submitted to us, the 1,200 projects, what if we started to apply some of these performance metrics to try to determine which of these projects move the needle more or less relative to freight efficiencies and whatnot? So that's kind of the context. So within that context, we've talked about some of these potential criteria. We've talked about this truck travel time reliability. It's called PM3. It's actual one of the federal performance criteria that the FHWA provides to the states. And it is something that we actually have to document as to how the federal freight dollars are starting to achieve this overall travel time reliability component. So that could be a metric that we could apply, but obviously that's truck-based, and again, not particularly multimodal. We always have a keen eye on safety, but we really need to qualify what that means and quantify that. What do we mean by safety? Do we mean reduction of accidents? Do we mean worker exposure? Do we mean reduction in conflicts between passenger rail and freight rail? Do we mean rate, collision reduction? What kind of safety component are we talking about? Speed. Is speed and speed reliability and velocity of the system important to us, or is actually reliability more important to us? That is a difficult one to grapple with, and how do we measure speed over the various multimodal systems? Delay, which is sort of a play on speed, sort of the reverse. You can get into vehicle hours of delay. That is a key metric that is also part of our Caltrans performance plan. We have a target for reducing overall daily hours of vehicle delay, but that very metric is actually diametrically clashing with the VMT reduction goal and the overall greenhouse gas reduction goal that the state has. We go on to bottlenecks. We have a number of bottlenecks in the state, and if you just looked at bottlenecks and said, well, why don't we tackle our bottlenecks? We could do bottleneck reliefs, and what would that do in terms of speed, delay reduction, and throughput, and that sort of thing. We can also apply a cost benefit. The CalBC is our California cost benefit model. We can look at the cost of a project and the relative benefit the way CalBC conceptualizes it. It has some shortcomings. It does not measure every benefit known to man. We talked about some of these here today in terms of community impacts and things like that. I've mentioned a little bit about vehicle miles traveled. That is a euphemism sometimes for greenhouse gas emission reduction. And it's a very tough topic in the freight industry when we're trying to move stuff. How do you actually reduce the number of vehicle miles traveled? We can get into the kinds of miles that are being traveled. We talked a little bit about the package delivery issues. There's certainly lots of anecdotal data when we talk about this relative to transportation network companies, the Uber and Lyfts of this world, that vehicle miles traveled are actually going up given those services, and it's creating urban congestion, and it's creating additional greenhouse gas emissions. Perhaps we don't want that sort of thing. Well, e-commerce is moving in that same exact direction. The stuff is being delivered to your house. How does that affect the overall environment? So you see this is a bit thorny. So what we need some help on is, first of all, verifying this very large list of projects for accuracy and for inclusion. And are there projects that we need to consider in these shorter time frames? I think anything beyond 2030 is not necessarily worthwhile including at this point. And we would certainly articulate why that's not the case. And then are there some projects that we could be pulling out specifically to talk about sustainable freight? We talk a lot, and the project list is very robust in traditional freight investments, but there really aren't a lot of sustainable freight emerging kind of projects in there, and I recognize those are just in development today. But we heard about some of that today here in terms of what the Port of Oakland is working on. Perhaps we could start highlighting some of those, and instead of just focusing on traditional infrastructure investments, we could talk about some of these IT and some other investments, cleaner fuels and equipment and things like that. So what's the upshot of all this? How would we use this list? We've struggled a little bit with this. I think we've come to the conclusion that to have sort of a shortened list that would sort of clearly articulate the key projects in this state is a little bit of a fool's errand. We don't think we're going to get there. We tried this in the 2014 plan as well. It's very, very hard to take this diversity of projects, apply lots of filters and metrics to it, and somehow boil this down to a shorter list and then say, here are the key winners out of this big list of priorities. What I think we'd rather try to do is work with all of you to try to tighten up this list, to really clearly articulate why these projects truly are freight projects, so that we can at least say we're capturing the current true universe of freight needs, and perhaps put a clear dollar figure to that, as well as a more robust timeline, as we mentioned here, within this sort of foreseeable 10-year future. And then perhaps just append that to the plan. And I don't mean just append it by reference, but really articulate something in the plan that there is an appendix, there is a robust list, we could break it down geographically, and it can then be used for reference purposes to inform policymakers and others to really understand what that financial need is and what that universe of potential projects is. We could slice it and dice it a number of different ways. We could break it down by different modalities and things like that. And at least the projects would be captured there. And we could hopefully try to articulate with those families of projects what it is we're trying to achieve. whether that's on a particular mode or that's in a particular region or whatever. So I think that's kind of where the staff are in trying to complete this endeavor. But we really need your feedback and your input. Like I said, I really want to thank the folks that have been participating in the trade investment meetings. It's been very helpful just to kind of get some clarity on what they want to do. And hopefully some of you are here, you can speak up as well. So we're inviting your input, your thoughts, and really the key that I'm highlighting here is this process to kind of engage with all of you to verify this list, refresh it, make sure that the key priorities are in there by those years that we talk about. Perhaps apply some of these screens to see whether any of those would help us identify some higher priority items. And if there's a desire to sort of use this process to also help the commission identify, those key funding priorities, I think that would also be a goal of ours. But we definitely want your feedback. So with that, I would love to hear from all of you and see how you feel about it. See tense up, yeah. Gary, Annie.
Can you hear me? Yeah. I'm relieved you guys are going to do more outreach because we didn't receive anything from SCAG on solicitation of our bigger project list. So that's good. Second, then it'd be great if obviously if Caltrans staff can contact us directly to provide information. On the process, I think it's a couple things. It's going to be challenging to apply the different performance metrics you identified in your screening criteria because I think everyone here would argue that they can satisfy those and you could do a Harvey ball, you're probably going to end up with this 1,248 projects still close to zero. I think you might want to consider, we talked about this at the first or the last CFAC meeting, using criterion that's need versus efficacy or outcome, and try to look at projects if there's a true need. Is it a project that actually is located where you have a high volume of freight being moved combined with a high amount of congestion? I think that's important. Another aspect too that I saw on the eligibility in terms of being in the improved RTP, I would urge you to allow some relaxation of that requirement because SCAG is releasing their 2020 RTP for draft review probably November, December, Annie? October. So for all intents and purposes, the projects that us in South Dakota and California have submitted already are informally approved and they're not going to be removed. And moreover, most of the projects actually don't even require the regional conforming analysis because they reduce emissions, in which case it's not an issue even for that aspect. So I ask you to relax that requirement. We have a few projects we've added since the last RTP, and again, rail freight separation or port projects that are built into the overall volumes. But again, I think probably some more focused discussion through the subcommittee meeting and maybe an in-person meeting of the subcommittee to really have it through this effectively with all the Caltrans districts and headquarters. I think it would be worthwhile to get a sense of what the projects are. And I know we talked about considering different types of projects. I suppose you could do that, although the 80-20 split already kind of sort of broke that out already. And like on the port projects, obviously some of them are going to have the velocity effect, but not necessarily the emission effect. The emission effect is going to be de facto because of the impending cargoes, cargo handling equipment, and obviously trucks too. So those need to be considered when you take a look at port-related projects. So, thanks.
If I can just add to that, Andy on SCAG. I am actually very concerned about the process. We were not, there was little to no coordination on the identification of the projects. And I'm particularly concerned because in our region, we do have a number of, we have a distinct list that we have continued to update. And so it definitely there needs to be a sit-down meeting to discuss how some of these projects were identified in the first place, insofar as the list that you guys have currently been screening or evaluating. As far as the criteria that you mentioned as well, I generally agree with Carrie. And I think for us, what we were looking at in the SCAG region is looking at various corridors and evaluating a number of those criteria on a quarter basis. For the most part, a lot of these projects, you're not going to be able to model each and every one of them separately. So I'm not quite sure how you're going to be able to make those kinds of detailed evaluations.
And so, yeah, I'll just chime in on that a little bit. So yes, frankly, I've heard from many of you, and our apologies, we did not do the most robust job in reaching out, and that is definitely a shortcoming. Part two, I agree. The struggle with evaluating projects individually is very difficult when you're really oftentimes talking about a corridor investment strategy, and you're probably needing to, what we talk often about is parent projects, large corridor-wide investment strategies, and then you're doing child investments, that smaller chunks of work that take time because you have to phase things. And so you really should be talking about the overall strategy within a corridor, what you're trying to do. Recognize that each project that you're doing is, one more pearl on that necklace, and eventually you're going to have that full benefit. So it is very difficult and challenging to evaluate the individual projects when they're sort of in isolation without really looking at the overall corridor functionality. So.
I dare not ask this question, but is there an easy to find 1,248 project list available online or elsewhere?
No.
Where to find those up-to-date
So
information?
it isn't yet, and part of the reason has been that we didn't want to just sort of send this out and go, here's a list, and check it out and look at it. We really wanted to make sure as we're working with the investment strategy team and the way we developed it, that it's a valid, reasonable thing for folks to actually look at. We don't want to circulate things that are just sort of garbage, to be perfectly honest. So I think it's our intent as part of this process to make sure that if we're going to update it and try to articulate this better and make sure we're sitting down and actually making positive, FaceTime with every regional partner to make sure their stuff is in there, then we can circulate that more broadly so that everyone can kind of take a closer look at it. That doesn't mean we're trying to hide anything. What we didn't want to do is circulate something and get everybody up in arms about it. But we really wanted to make sure that this was a technical exercise with the investment team that ultimately would turn into something that you all would see before it would ever get included in the plan. So at some convenient time, we want to disseminate that to all of you for specific review and comment as well. So if you see things on there that maybe shouldn't be on there, or things that are still missing, that we provide that opportunity as well. And this timeline really is only for this subcommittee. This is not intended to ultimately bypass you in any way or shape or form. We bring this back to you at a future CFAC meeting for sure and get that out even in advance.
And I was also going to ask on the next slide where you have the screening criteria listed out. So we also talked a little bit about air quality screening criteria, pretty much matching the screening criteria that were utilized for the 2006-2007 TCIF effort. So, projects that provide those air quality benefits at the regional and community level, whether it's a corridor level project or smaller, that would definitely be beneficial to have those screening criteria. And, if somebody were proposing a project and wanting to show that, there's a lot of modeling and analytical ways to show that. But as mentioned earlier today, through these AB 617 activities, or, if you have a project that aligns with one of those, or the West Oakland Truck Management Plan, that's an easy way to show there's already been groundwork done and justification for this type of project that benefits the surrounding community. So a proposed project could easily just point to one of those things and talk about how it supports the goals of those efforts.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. When we talk about the inclusion in the regional transportation plan, I think, largely transportation projects that get funded need to be in the regional transportation plan. But recognizing we're doing other things, other types of planning work, community planning level stuff, air quality planning work, the ports have master plans. I mean, there's lots of other planning documents that have been developed and have been fairly inclusive. We should acknowledge those as well and make sure that projects are being pulled from those so we can really expand the universe of what we're talking about here. Ultimately, we do have to figure out where they need to be in the RTP relative to if a project is chosen for funding and gets programmed. But I think that's a technical step potentially But in terms of capturing the universe of potential projects, I think we could certainly cast a wider net and make sure we're more inclusive in that regard, so.
We got a hand over here without a tent.
And without a tent, yeah.
I'm Teresa Jago, Port of Long Beach. Given that there's such a high number of projects and diverse needs in the state, I want to go back to what Michael Cano asked about goals and what is the goal for the state of California when it comes to movement of cargo, whether it's to serve primarily our state needs first and then look at discretionary needs, because there's always going to be at the regional level very distinct needs that we're trying to serve. So I think stepping back and addressing priorities at the state level may help then to apply the criteria in a way that we can look more broadly versus just identifying regional or sub-regional needs. And then still having a struggle with narrowing down 1,200 plus projects to a manageable level.
Yeah, and obviously we haven't tackled that yet, and I appreciate you guys all bringing it up. That has always been a concern, and it comes up in various forms as to, what is the goal of the industry as a whole. And if we treat everything equal, then, we don't parse that out particularly well. But we could certainly have that conversation, and if ultimately we want to screen, an overall universe of projects against that type of policy direction, we can also do that. We can sort of do that after the fact if we want to take that tack. But I think that's a policy conversation that we haven't really had enough of at CFAC level. We can certainly bring that back up at a future meeting and agendize that and really talk more specifically about that, because I think many of you are in the discretionary freight movement business, right? And so it's not for us to necessarily dictate whether that's a good thing or bad thing, but there ought to be a conversation about it, and we need to recognize there are dramatic implications as to how much we do or don't focus on discretionary freight versus the needs of our own populace. So I'll just let that hang there.
So Michael was next. Gary, are you still up?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So Michael.
Thank you, Michael Connor, LA Metro. I definitely want to echo comments from Andy over at SCAG, and BMPO for SCAG flows greatly from the kinds of projects that are developed at the RTK level. And for us, our projects, currently backing a lot of them are linked intrinsically to expansion plans, which are rather inflexible. I mean, it'd be great if, money was available in a program for different projects for discretionary uses, but the way that it is for all of us these days is you have to have an ordinance with line items with projects attached. So sometimes you don't get maybe the perfect freight project, but I think the goal of the CFMP should be to allow us to take a project that may be imperfect and to align it with other improvements or other projects that mitigate issues so that you have a better systemic investment in a region. For example, we had a very successful application from the last TSEP round where we linked the on-dock rail improvements of ports with grade separations along those rail corridors, whereas the grade separation by itself may not have competed as well. The two of them together formed a natural nexus and created a link that I would think the CFMP would encourage when we look at corridor-based investment programs. I think the Solutions for Congested Corridors program is forcing our agencies to deal with that and grapple with it and try to explain how the entire corridor benefits from an improvement. It might be multiple improvements together. It might be a highway improvement that leads to benefits to the corridor. But if that's where the CFMP is going in that direction, then I would be very interested to see how those linkages are identified. If it's just a bunch of discrete projects, or are there ways that we can recognize linked projects that, you might be funding this project in this cycle, but this project coming down the next cycle is part of that same package, and therefore it's not put at a disadvantage because it may not compete by itself.
So I think the point you're making is a really, really good one. These projects shouldn't just be evaluated and stand in isolation. I mean, that is not how they're planned for, and that's not how they're programmed at the regional level either. And so when you just sort of see a distinct ask for a particular investment, it doesn't seem to necessarily make sense if you don't articulate it in that holistic fashion.
I think, again, I think from the investment strategy perspective, at the commission as well, is that, we previously had these corridors identified. And I think within those corridors, I think the folks that participate in the corridors could talk about what their priorities are. And while there were some funding targets, whatever those numbers are, I'm not sure we need to worry necessarily about the numbers, but what are those needs in those key corridors? And have the conversation at that sub-regional level to say, what is the border corridor need? What is the LA corridor need? What is that mid-state need that we've now identified? What is the north state need? And maybe that planning conversation should be happening at that regionalized level. So all the good work that you all are doing with each other already anyway at that regional level, whether it's embedded in the RTP or the RTPA's local plans or port plan, whatever it is, that you all are talking with each other. And if, given measures, given those local investments that are being leveraged, you guys are already setting the table for where those priorities are. And you've already done the sort of the prioritization at the regional level. I think then it's really just articulating that at a rolled up state level, and maybe that's the way to do it. So I'll just sort of throw that out there as a potential strategy to think about, because I think that might be an easier conversation to have than having the statewide conversation. If it's more regionalized, you all are talking to the usual suspects, and I think you guys might accidentally get on the same page with each other. Right? So, anyway.
So we got 8 minutes and 4 tenths. So we'll start down there with Kerry.
Thanks. Actually, that's perfectly what I was going to mention, Chris, is that I think I mentioned this at the outset, we all do, that trying to do a lot of that process to the regions to make it easier for Caltrans as a whole. And I would urge then us that we have MPO area specific needs as soon as possible to go through these lists. I can say that in Southern California, we've been very good, very diligent in policing ourselves in terms of project eligibility. No one comes to the table with the so-called focus projects. They know they're here from me, loud and clear. So I would urge those meetings right away, and I think it's ideal then to develop a program of projects for each corridor area. On the another specific issue on the so-called discretionary versus non-discretionary, I think we should avoid that at all costs and not even consider that. The boxes are coming here, regardless, they've been here for 30 years, they're going to continue for 30 years, whether it's 29% or 28% or 32%, they're still going to be here. And so I think we should keep away from that discussion. Because just to point out that, in fact, the pure domestic carbon leakage through these regions is huge. And so that is critical to the competitiveness of the issue as well. It's not just international and waterborne carbon. So we should be mindful of that.
Yes, Adam Milton from MTC. So I just echo some of the similar comments. We are also in the process of updating our regional transportation plan. So I was curious on the timing of when you want to wrap up kind of a project list, because we are asking from our partners for some new potential ideas. And with that, and partially it's important because of the new funding source that may have been assumed in previous plans like SB1 that would provide a lot of extra funding and capacity for these types of projects that may not have been there before. So just a little bit curious on the timing, because I think we're trying to get some ideas by the end of the June, July time frame. But
yeah, so, I think the timeline that I put up here is sort of draftish timeline to sort of keep the ball moving here a little bit and keep the dialogue going. Ultimately, we have to adopt a freight plan in the state by the end of 2019. And if ultimately we append some sort of list, we can certainly do that. We can also update that list at any time. We're not held to having this static list or whatever. The only thing that we really have to do is have the freight investment program in the plan itself, tying up the federal funds. We've done that already. And every time the commission programs new funds, we'll update that appropriately. So if we, as part of developing the plan, want to have some list of what money we need, I'm using very broad terms here. We can certainly have a funding section. We talk about the needs and what we're trying to aspire to do, et cetera, et cetera. And then we could always append some sort of a list to this plan at the end. And that can be very close to the time that we actually seek adoption. So that could happen relatively late in
this calendar year. I don't want to put a specific date on that because ultimately, as we go through the various reviews, we want to make sure people have a chance to actually see what's in there. But if we do what we've been talking about, meeting with regions, talking about these corridor investments, talking about allowing this new stuff to be included, I think we can do that. The difficulty is, and again, I don't want to speak for commission staff, but Don does have, or Garth has his tent up, but that might be Don's tent. That they need some help too. How do they pick projects when there's a funding call at the end of this year? And can this plan inform that process? And can we keep this dialogue going perhaps through the guideline development process, because there's going to be additional workshops for that. And obviously the CFAC will meet again, the investment strategy subcommittee will meet again. So we are as flexible as we need to be. Our goal is to, at the end of the day, articulate what the needs are so that somewhere someone can turn to a document and say, aha, here's the stuff. This is what the state of California aspires to do when it comes to investing in the freight industry. Timing, end of 2019.
And then the one last just point of caution too. I know in our regional transportation plans, with limited funds, we're often constrained in terms of what projects we can include, and often we'll focus then on the cores of our regions to some degree. So I think just looking at how we connect to other regions is certainly an area for consideration.
Yes, and we have an eye on that.
Yeah, thank you. Mike Jacob, say. Chris, thank you for actually adding that to the question. I think that's kind of spot on, and the thing that really kind of struck me is you, especially on that slide, your presentation of 1,250 projects, and the response is, we need more projects.
I know, it sounds a lot.
It is a little bit striking because, when we looked at CFMT first go around, we ended up with like 770 something projects, but no prioritization, right? So then this group was tasked with, immediately after finishing CFMT, like, what do you want to do with the list? So if we could avoid that would be great. I think to Michael's point, it was echoed by Annie and Carrie, the RTP plans, and we actually point regularly to the SCAG RTP and their very specific focus on goods movement, the identification of the challenges that they have within the region is corridor based, right? You guys have a very specific bottleneck ranking, which is helpful. So even though those aren't multimodal projects, for most of our customers, they wouldn't ask us to go back out to the state to ask for projects in the fence line if they could fix a bottleneck, right? And so those might be listed as highway projects, but they certainly have multimodal benefits. They've been evaluated within the context of the region, right? The regional plans, again, we point to SCAG as being a model for doing this with respect to their goods movement appendix, have taken all of those additional considerations into account with respect to environmental. They've gone through a SQL process for their RTP. It's very robust. So as long as it's in that corridor context, I don't think you guys need to sit here and say, we need more projects. I think the proper response would be, how do we make sure that happens in that right context? And then I'd just like to echo Carrie's second comment about cautioning you against trying to distinguish between discretionary and non-discretionary cargo. It's problematic. No, I think the way Michael framed it in the last hearing was that there are economic impacts that we need to analyze. I totally agree with that, right? One of the criteria that's not listed anywhere is ROI. And the reason why it isn't is because it's exceptionally hard to try to do that across projects. We've had that discussion with CTC off and on. How do you include economic considerations in your programming? And it's next to impossible to do. It's good for us to continue to talk about it at a policy level, but on a project-by-project basis, it's exceptionally difficult to do. But that doesn't mean that you should sit here and start saying, well, if this is discretionary or not discretionary, let's not do it. All cargo is discretionary. It's a price point. And on the same reasons why you would not want to have that same type of filter for cargo at the Port of Oakland, that you would at the Port of LA and Port of Long Beach is the exact same reason why you wouldn't want to try to set up a statewide screening criteria based on it, right? I mean, if you have a port that's a 50-50 cargo mix on import and export, where's the discretionary impact of cross-subsidization of your import cargo? It's going to be totally different than it is in LA and Long Beach. Even if you're moving the same amount of export containers out of LA and Long Beach, the costs are for the infrastructure when they're distributed across that system are just totally different. That's more of a fool's errand than trying to determine ROI. So moving forward, I mean, I think the good news is you guys have 500 more projects to go through. The bad news is you got 500 more projects to go through. So we'll be happy to participate.
Yeah, so I appreciate the comments, and you can see that we are not trying to presuppose anything, right? I think this is a struggle for everyone, and thanks for reminding us that, yes, we started with 700, we're so far past that already. That, hopefully we can utilize this process that's up here in green to really try to have these meetings in the month of April with our regional partners, talk a little bit about this a little bit, with all of you. Whether that list is refined, shrunken, expanded, we need to have a clear understanding of what we're trying to accomplish. And then bring this back to future CFAC meeting and talk about how we incorporate it in the plan. It strikes me that there's a preference not to rank, not evaluate. We can maybe talk high level, how to do this at a quarter level, how to be deferential to the planning work that goes at the regional level, given that that's really where the primary benefit is going to be derived from anyway if that investment is made. Maybe we tear off of that a little bit, be more deferential to that regional planning process, and then the CFMP really just articulate that and say, we do this kind of work at the regional level. We prioritize projects, we pick winners and losers, we prioritize our funding, and that's part of what we've espoused to do here. When we roll that up in totality to the state, I think we could maybe articulate that vision in some manner, and that might be different in sort of saying, here are all the projects. Maybe that's a different approach, maybe one higher level or something.
So I realize we're dipping into your lunch hour a little bit. We got 2 more 10s. Can we get through those quickly, please? Darwin, you were you were, but it doesn't make whatever. Go ahead. Darwin.
It's actually me. So this is Dawn with the CPC. So just a couple of comments. Thinking that for the trade corridor program that I oversee at the commission level, and thinking back to the 2 kickoff workshops we just had in March, the section in your discussion about screening metrics, it feels like that's very kind of in line as to where the competitive programs at the commission is headed towards, because that was the basis of our first workshops in March and discussion items that we wanted to talk about. And as each one of those competitive programs move forward, and the trade being one of them, we're going to have more discussions about what those metrics should be for calculating the benefits for a project. So it feels like that's in line with it. The other comment that I would just like to make is, if I remember correctly, and don't quote me, but in the legislation that created the requirement for having the freight plan, I believe there's some language in there about performance measures. And so I don't know that our current plan has performance measures in it yet, or in it. So what would that be? What would that look like in a new plan? Because it does actually say that in legislation. And maybe that could be help determine what this screening metrics is or something. I had a third item and I just now lost it. The third item would be, I'm understanding Chris to be saying that this list, as to however it's created and how many ever projects get there, is being used for multiple purposes. It's just not for the commission's trade corridor program. So hopefully everyone's thinking about it in those terms and not just thinking, oh, I need this list to get my project into the commission's programs, because it sounds like it's being used for multiple reasons and not just that. So just a couple of comments.
Agreed, and thank you for clarifying that. Yes, you're right. We do have to have some performance measures in the plan to sort of articulate that. And I think, at a high level, we can certainly ping off some of the ones we have up here. We can also do a high-level discussion within the plan about how the system is performing today and how we're evaluating that. So
I know I'm in the position of keeping people from lunch, so I'll try to make it brief. But I wanted to comment on the idea of shortening or lengthening the list and maybe offer up a different approach that's more about alignment than it is about length. And specifically, I really appreciate the simply articulated criteria over there that are incredibly complex, but stated very simply over there of definition, time frame, RTP constraint, and sustainability principles. I really do think that that's a great place to start and focus in terms of conversations. I think the challenges that will come up is, defining some of those things become incredibly challenging, but I see this as an opportunity for Caltrans and the state to work with regional partners to really think about, even if we're not shortening the list, can we tier and prioritize projects that do align with the state goals and the plan that we just heard about, that we're putting forward, that lays kind of specific areas of issues and I don't know how well those issues and the sustainability principles are currently reflected in the projects going forward, and it's hard to articulate that for 1,200 projects. But the idea, I really like the comment about focusing on specific corridors that have already been identified as focus areas and creating some sort of messaging around those that does show this list to the public and folks that we're accountable to outside of our own industry as to how these are specifically great priorities for the state that align with our goals. And I know that's a really hard task for me to say, but I wanted to provide that framework.
Thanks. All right, so looks like I've taken some of your lunch, so let's start up again at 1:05.